It did not begin with the battles we remember. It did not begin with hedgerows dripping with rain or tanks grinding through narrow lanes. It began with the weight of a victory that had not yet been earned. When the Americans broke through the beaches of Normandy, they did not find open fields or triumph waiting beyond the sand. They found a trap, a land designed by nature and perfected by the enemy to swallow armies whole. The Battle of Normandy was not a single fight. It was a slow, crushing struggle that tested every fibre of the American soldier. A war fought not across grand, sweeping plains, but through farmland, orchards, stone villages, and hedgerows older than nations. Walls of earth and tangled roots that turned each field into its own battlefield, each hedge a fortress, each lane a kill zone. But the story began before the first tank rolled off the beach. In the days after D-Day, American troops stared inland at a landscape they had been told would be easy to cross. It was nothing of the sort. Norman farmland looked peaceful from above, but from the ground it was a labyrinth. Thick, ancient hedgerows rose taller than a man, woven with gnarled roots and packed earth so dense, even explosions barely scarred them. German veterans waited behind each one, invisible until the moment they opened fire. Commanders who had planned for rapid advance now faced a truth they had not wanted to accept. Normandy would not be won in days. It would be won inch by inch, hedge by hedge, village by village, against an enemy fighting with the desperation of men cornered in land they believed they could hold. For the Americans, it was a brutal awakening. They had survived the beaches. Now they had to survive the bocage. Every morning, the air hung heavy with mist and the bitter smell of cordite. Patrols moved through lanes so narrow 2 men could barely walk side by side. Above them, branches stretched into a ceiling of leaves, casting shadows that hid danger in every direction. German snipers watched from windows smashed into splinters. Machine guns waited behind hedges so thick they swallowed sound. Mortar rounds drifted down from unseen positions, turning quiet fields into sudden storms of dirt and steel. Progress slowed to a crawl. A single mile could take an entire day. Casualties climbed. Units disappeared into farmland that became graveyards. And yet, the Americans pushed on, because they had no other choice. Behind them lay the beaches they had bled to take. Ahead lay the road to France's liberation. Between them stretched a world built to break the men who entered it. And still, they adapted. Engineers welded steel teeth onto tanks. Infantry learned to breach hedgerows with explosives and speed. Squads moved like hunters through unfamiliar terrain, learning to survive a kind of warfare no textbook had ever prepared them for. Victory would not belong to the fastest or the strongest. It would belong to those who could endure, improvise, and refuse to let fear take root. Villages that had slept for centuries became battlegrounds of fire and shattered stone. Saint-Lô, once a quiet Norman town, was ground into dust under shells that fell day and night. The fields around Carrington turned to mud mixed with blood as paratroopers fought in rain that never seemed to end. The American sector became a landscape of ruin, where birds no longer sang and every breeze carried the whisper of gunfire. Yet the belief that Normandy could still be won never died. Slowly, through attrition and adaptation, through relentless pressure and sacrifice, the Americans began to break the German defences. Each hedgerow taken was one less shield for the enemy. Each village liberated unlocked another path forward. The Germans fought with grim precision, but they were trapped in a tightening circle. Their lines stretched thin. Their armour dwindled. Their reinforcements faltered. And then came the moment everything changed. Operation Cobra. The strike meant to shatter the stalemate. Bombers roared overhead. The earth convulsed under explosions, so powerful the sky itself seemed to shake. When the smoke cleared, the German defences had been ripped open. Into that breach poured American armour, infantry, and renewed purpose. Normandy, once a cage, became a gateway. But this is not just a story of victory. It is a story of endurance. Of fear and grit, of frustration and resolve, of men who fought not just the enemy but the land itself, of a battlefield that demanded not glory, but everything else a soldier had left to give. Tonight, we return to those hedgerows, to the fields that chewed up divisions, to the villages where history froze in smoke, to the moment when the Americans learned that Normandy would not be taken with speed, but with stubborn, grinding, unbreakable will. Before we begin, Tell me in words where in the world you are tuning in from tonight and what hour it is for you as we step into the bocage together. Are you somewhere calm and warm, or can you almost feel that thick Normandy fog brushing against your face as this story unfolds? And if these long, deep journeys into the past help you relax, reflect, unwind, or drift into sleep, consider subscribing. The reconnaissance pilot felt his hands tighten on the controls as he dropped to 300 feet above the French coast. It was May 19th, 1944, and Flight Lieutenant James Harper was doing something the RAF had forbidden 6 months earlier, flying low enough to count individual obstacles on the beaches below. Through breaks in the morning haze, he could see them clearly now. Thousands of wooden stakes jutting from the sand like broken teeth. Steel hedgehogs welded at angles designed to rip open landing craft. Concrete walls thick enough to shatter artillery shells. His camera clicked automatically, capturing what intelligence analysts in London had been desperate to see for months. The Atlantic war wasn't just formidable anymore. It had become something else entirely. Something that made the cliffs of Dover look like gentle hills by comparison. Harper pulled up sharply as tracer fire arcs toward his Spitfire, knowing that the photographs in his camera might determine whether the invasion happened at all. The fortress waiting for the Allies in Normandy wasn't built in a day, or even a year. It was the obsession of two men who disagreed on everything, except that the invasion, when it came, would be the most important battle of the war. Adolf Hitler issued Directive 51 in January 1944, declaring that France would be held at all costs, that no other theatre mattered as much, that every available resource would flow to the coastal defences. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arrived in France that same month, took one look at the beach obstacles and declared them woefully inadequate. The Desert Fox, Germany's most celebrated general, had read the Allied playbook. He knew they would come at dawn, at low tide, when the obstacles would be exposed. He knew they would bring overwhelming firepower. And he knew that Germany's only chance was to destroy the invasion on the beaches, in the first hours, before the Allies could establish a foothold. Everything after that would be too late. Rommel transformed the Atlantic Wall from a propaganda facade into a genuine killing ground with terrifying speed. In the 4 months between January and May 1944, German engineers laid more mines and obstacles than in the previous 2 years combined. 6.5 million mines were buried in the sand and cliff tops of France. 517,000 beach obstacles, wooden stakes, steel hedgehogs, concrete tetrahedrons, many topped with mines, were driven into the tidal zones between high and low watermarks. At a single strong point overlooking what the Allies called Omaha Beach, designated WN62 by the Germans, Rommel personally inspected the defences and ordered additional fortifications. 8 reinforced concrete bunkers, 4 artillery pieces in steel-doored casemates, 12 machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire covering 1,200 yards of beach, every weapon positioned to fire parallel to the waterline, creating killing zones with no dead space, no cover, nowhere to hide. The engineers estimated that a single battalion defending WN62 could hold against an entire division. Behind the beaches, Rommel created obstacles that didn't appear on any Allied intelligence map because they seemed too insane to build. He ordered the flooding of the low-lying fields behind Utah Beach, creating what he called artificial swamps by damming rivers and canals. German engineers worked through the spring of 1944, systematically flooding 40 square miles of Norman farmland. The water level varied from 2 to 4 feet deep, shallow enough that it looked passable from aerial reconnaissance, deep enough to drown a man wearing 80 pounds of equipment. Any paratrooper landing in Rommel's swamps at night would face a choice between drowning in his harness or cutting away his equipment and losing his weapons. The fields that Norman farmers had cultivated for centuries became death traps designed to kill soldiers before they ever saw an enemy. Rommel walked these fields himself in April, nodding with satisfaction as his boots sank into water that shouldn't have been there. The first 6 hours of the invasion will be decisive, he told his staff. For the Allies, as well as for Germany, it'll be the longest day. The German 91st Air Landing Division held the ground behind Utah Beach with one specific mission: stop the paratroopers. This wasn't a static coastal defense unit filled with aging reservists and foreign conscripts. This was 7,800 men specifically trained and positioned to counterattack airborne forces. Their commander, Wilhelm Falle, was a paratrooper himself. He knew the tactics, the vulnerabilities, the chaos of night drops. His division held the key crossroads, the causeways, the bridges that any airborne force would need to seize. Intelligence reports suggested the Allies would drop paratroopers to secure the beach exits, and Falley positioned his battalions accordingly. They had rehearsed counterattacks against scattered paratrooper units. They knew the terrain intimately, they were dug in, supplied, and ready. When the invasion came, Falley's division would have one job: kill the paratroopers before they could organise, before they could secure their objectives, before they could link up with forces landing on the beaches. It was a sound plan, meticulously prepared, and it would fail in ways nobody anticipated. But the fortress had a fatal flaw that Rommel saw clearly and could do nothing to fix. There weren't enough soldiers to man it. The Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to Spain, 3,000 miles of coastline that Hitler insisted must all be defended. The defences at Normandy were formidable, but they were designed for garrisons that didn't exist. WN-62 was built to hold a full company of infantry, 200 men rotating through the bunkers and trenches. Instead, it held 85 men on June 6th, most of them teenage conscripts from occupied territories who'd been in uniform less than a year. The same pattern repeated at strongpoint after strongpoint along the Normandy coast, fortifications designed for battalions held by companies. Positions that should have been impregnable were vulnerable simply because there weren't enough men to watch all the approaches. Rommel requested additional divisions, additional troops, additional anything. The requests went to Berlin and disappeared into the bureaucracy of a regime that believed its own propaganda about the Atlantic Wall being invincible. French resistance operatives knew things about the Atlantic Wall that Allied intelligence could only guess at. In late May 1944, a photographer named René Duches walked along the beach at Vers-sur-Mer with a camera hidden inside a cigarette case. He was supposedly inspecting the German fortifications as part of his forced labour assignment, but every few minutes he would pause, adjust his cigarette case, and click the hidden shutter. The photographs he produced showed beach obstacles from ground level, the exact spacing, the mine placements, details that aerial reconnaissance couldn't capture. Duches passed the film to a resistance courier who smuggled it to London via a fishing boat and a submarine rendezvous. When Allied intelligence analysts developed the film, they saw for the first time exactly what an infantryman would face stepping off a landing craft. They saw that the gaps between obstacles were narrower than expected. They saw that many obstacles carried telemines on top, turning each wooden stake into a ship killer. They saw that Rommel's engineers had thought of everything. But they also saw something else. The defences were incomplete. In some sectors, entire rows of obstacles were missing. The fortress was powerful, but it wasn't finished. Hitler himself made the critical decision about how to defend France, and it was the wrong decision made for the wrong reasons. In early 1944, he became convinced that the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. Every intelligence report from German spies in England confirmed it. Massive Allied forces gathering in southeast England, radio traffic indicating an army group commanded by Patton preparing to cross at the Dover Strait. Reconnaissance flights showing huge tank parks and supply depots positioned perfectly for a Calais assault. Based on this intelligence, Hitler kept the German 15th Army in 19 divisions, 250,000 men. His strongest mobile reserves positioned at Pas de Calais. He kept them there in May, he kept them there in June, and most incredibly, he would keep them there for weeks after the Normandy invasion began, convinced that Normandy was merely a feint, that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. The 15th Army sat in their fortifications watching for an invasion that would never come while Normandy burned 150 miles away. It was one of the most successful deceptions in military history, and it was about to be tested. The Allied planners studying reconnaissance photographs in May 1944 knew they were looking at something unprecedented in military history. Never before had an army attempted an amphibious assault against fortified beaches defended by a first-rate military power. The Gallipoli landings in World War I had been a catastrophe. The Dieppe raid in 1942 had been a bloodbath where 68% of the attacking force became casualties in 9 hours. Every historical precedent suggested that assaulting Rommel's Atlantic Wall would be suicide, but they also knew there was no alternative. Stalin was demanding a second front. The build-up of forces in England had reached the point where invasion was inevitable simply because there was nowhere else to put all the men and equipment. The planners looked at the maps and the photographs and the casualty estimates, and they knew that thousands of men would die in the first hours. They knew that entire units might be wiped out before reaching the seawall. They knew that the plan required almost everything to go right and assumed that many things would go wrong. What they didn't know was whether the fortress could be breached at all. The fortress waiting in Normandy in June 1944 was the most formidable defensive position the Allies would face in the entire European campaign. It combined German engineering, Rommel's tactical genius, years of preparation, and the desperation of a regime that knew it was losing the war. The bunkers were reinforced with steel and concrete thick enough to withstand battleship guns. The machine gun positions offered interlocking fields of fire with no blind spots. The obstacles and mines turned the beaches into mechanical death traps. The flooded fields behind Utah Beach promised to drown paratroopers by the hundreds. And behind it all stood divisions of German soldiers who knew they were defending the last barrier between the Allies and the heart of the Third Reich. Intelligence analysts in London estimated that if everything went wrong, if the Germans were fully alert and the weather turned, if the defences proved as strong as they appeared, the invasion could fail completely. The first waves could be destroyed on the beaches, the follow-up waves could be turned back, and the war in Europe could be prolonged by years. No one said these things out loud, but everyone thought them. The fortress they said couldn't be breached was waiting. And in 2 weeks, 156,000 men would find out if it could be done. The inflatable Sherman tank took shape slowly in the English countryside as 3 soldiers worked the pump. It was April 19th, 1944, and the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were manufacturing an army that didn't exist. The rubber Sherman weighed 65 pounds, compared to 33 tons for the real thing, and could be carried by 4 men and inflated in 15 minutes. From 500 feet up, where German reconnaissance planes flew when they managed to penetrate British air defences, it looked perfectly real. The tracks were painted canvas. The gun barrel was a rubber tube supported by an internal frame. The whole thing would blow away in a strong wind, but through a camera lens or binoculars at altitude, it was indistinguishable from the genuine article. The soldiers positioned it carefully in the tank park at Dover, visible, from across the channel on a clear day, one of hundreds of fake tanks creating the illusion of an enormous armoured force preparing to cross the strait. A corporal stepped back and lit a cigarette, looking at their rubber creation. "Think they're buying it?" he asked. His sergeant shrugged. "They better be. Whole war depends on it." The deception operation that would determine the fate of D-Day began not with soldiers, but with bureaucrats, mathematicians, and one extraordinary Spanish spy. In January 1943, British intelligence officers created the London Controlling Section, with a single mandate: make the Germans believe the invasion would come anywhere except where it actually would. They called it Operation Fortitude, and it became the most elaborate deception in military history. The scale was staggering. Entire fake divisions would be created on paper and in German intelligence files. Phantom radio traffic would simulate army groups that existed only as radio. Operators reading scripts. Rubber tanks, plywood bombers, and canvas landing craft would fill bases and airfields across England. Double agents would feed carefully calibrated lies to German intelligence. And all of it would point to one place, Pas de Calais, the obvious choice, the location Hitler was already predisposed to believe. The deception planners understood something fundamental about human psychology. People see what they expect to see, and Hitler expected Calais. Juan Pujol Garcia arrived in Lisbon in 1941 with an offer for British intelligence. He would become a double agent. The British initially rejected him, not trusting a Spanish national with no credentials and an improbable story. So Garcia went to the Germans instead, convinced them he was living in London when he was actually in Lisbon, and began filing intelligence reports compiled from newspapers, train schedules, and his imagination. The Germans believed him completely. His reports were filed, analysed, and acted upon. When British intelligence finally recruited him in 1942 and gave him the codename Garbo, they discovered they'd stumbled onto something remarkable. The Germans didn't just trust Garcia. They considered him their best source in England. They paid him £31,000 over the course of the war. They awarded him the Iron Cross. And in the spring of 1944, Garcia would feed them the most important lie of the war, that the Normandy invasion was merely a diversion. That the real assault was coming at Pas de Calais under the command of General George Patton. The 1st United States Army Group existed only in radio transmissions and German intelligence files, but it was the most important army that never was. Allied deception planners created an entire fictional order of battle in southeast England. 11 divisions that existed on paper but nowhere else. An army group headquarters supposedly commanded by Patton, the general the Germans feared most. Radio operators transmitted thousands of messages daily, using authentic military communication patterns that German signals intelligence could intercept and analyze. The messages referenced supply problems, training exercises, personnel transfers, all the mundane details of a real army preparing for invasion. German intelligence analysts plotted the radio intercepts on maps and saw exactly what they were supposed to see: a massive force gathering opposite Calais. The Phantom Army had fake unit patches, fake shoulder insignia, even fake newspaper reports in controlled British papers about Patton's activities in Kent. German spies who'd been turned by British intelligence submitted reports confirming everything, and Hitler's intelligence services never questioned it because it all fit their expectations perfectly. Operation Taxable launched on the night of June 5th, hours before the actual invasion, and it was one of the strangest missions of the war. 18 RAF bombers flew precise patterns over the English Channel northeast of the actual invasion fleet, dropping aluminum strips called window at carefully timed intervals. On German radar screens, the aluminum created returns identical to ships, hundreds of ships moving slowly toward Calais in formation. At the same time, small boats equipped with radar reflectors sailed parallel courses, enhancing the illusion. German radar operators watched what appeared to be an enormous invasion fleet heading directly for Pas-de-Calais, exactly where intelligence had predicted. They radioed alerts up the chain of command. Coastal batteries went on full alert, infantry divisions moved to assault positions, and all of it was fake metal strips falling into the sea and a dozen boats with radar reflectors creating the signature of an armada. By the time the Germans realized the Calais fleet was a phantom, the real invasion was already underway, 150 miles away. The psychological warfare extended beyond fake equipment and false radio traffic into something more personal and more devastating. Allied intelligence operatives spent months carefully crafting the public persona of General George Patton as the commander of the fictional First Army Group. Patton was photographed visiting bases in southeast England. British newspapers ran stories about his inspections of troops. German spies reported his presence at Dover and Canterbury. The Germans knew Patton's reputation from North Africa and Sicily. They knew he was aggressive, brilliant, and dangerous. They also knew that the Allies would never launch a major invasion without their best general. So when intelligence confirmed that Patton was in southeast England commanding a massive force opposite Calais, every assumption the Germans held was reinforced. What they didn't know was that Patton was being deliberately kept away from the real invasion planning, that his presence in Kent was theatre, that the Allies were using his reputation as a weapon more powerful than any tank. The Ghost Army's greatest creation wasn't rubber equipment or radio deceptions. It was the Phantom Patton, and the Germans believed in him completely. The German intelligence services fell for the deception so completely that they would continue believing it long after D-Day proved them wrong. On June 6th, as American soldiers died on Omaha Beach and paratroopers fought in the Norman hedgerows, the German 15th Army remained at Pas-de-Calais, 19 divisions, 250,000 men, hundreds of tanks, artillery battalions, mobile reserves, all positioned to repel an invasion that would never come, and they stayed there. On June 7th, German intelligence officers analysed the Normandy landings and concluded they were a diversion. Agent Garbo sent a message to his German handlers warning that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. The Germans believed him and held the 15th Army in position. On June 8th, Allied intelligence intercepted German communications, showing that Hitler personally ordered the 15th Army to remain at Calais, convinced that Patton's army group was still waiting to cross. The deception had worked so perfectly that even overwhelming evidence couldn't break it. The Germans saw what they expected to see, and they never recovered from the mistake. The scale of resources that the Germans wasted defending against phantom armies revealed just how completely Operation Fortitude succeeded. The 2nd Panzer Division and the 116th Panzer Division, two of Germany's most powerful armoured formations, sat at Pas-de-Calais through the first weeks of June. These weren't infantry divisions filled with old men and foreign conscripts. These were elite units with Tiger tanks, experienced crews, and the mobility to reach Normandy in 2 days of hard marching. If they'd been positioned in Normandy on June 6th, they could have counterattacked the beaches while the Americans were still establishing their foothold. If they'd arrived on June 7th, they could have struck the paratroopers before the beach and airborne forces linked up. Instead, they waited at Calais for an invasion that existed only in radio traffic and German imagination. When they finally received orders to move to Normandy on July 25th, 7 weeks after D-Day, the battle was already decided. The Ghost Army had tied down one of Germany's most powerful formations without firing a shot. The economic cost of the deception was measured not in dollars but in German divisions. Allied intelligence analysts, calculating the impact of Operation Fortitude, came to a staggering conclusion. The operation effectively removed 19 German divisions from the battle before it began. These weren't divisions destroyed in combat or captured or surrendered. They were divisions that simply never arrived at Normandy because they were defending the wrong section of coast. If even a quarter of the 15th Army had been positioned in Normandy on June 6th, the invasion would have faced overwhelming force. The beaches might have been held, the paratroopers might have been destroyed, the whole enterprise might have failed. But those divisions weren't there because a Spanish double agent, some rubber tanks, and carefully scripted radio transmissions had convinced Hitler and his intelligence services that the threat was somewhere else. War is often decided by logistics, tactics, and firepower. But sometimes it's decided by making the enemy defend everything while you attack one place. The Ghost Army didn't capture ground or kill soldiers. It created space where there wasn't any, time when there wasn't enough, and opportunity where none should have existed. The true genius of Operation Fortitude revealed itself not in what the Germans believed, but in how long they continued believing it after reality proved them wrong. Even after the Normandy beachhead was clearly established, even after 1 million Allied soldiers were ashore, even after the breakout from the hedgerows began, German intelligence continued filing reports about Patton's Phantom Army Group preparing to invade Calais. The deception had been constructed so carefully, with so many interlocking pieces of evidence, that German analysts couldn't untangle truth from fiction. Every piece of false intelligence reinforced every other piece. The radio traffic supported the agent reports matched the reconnaissance photographs, the photographs confirmed the radio traffic. It was a perfect loop of deception that fed itself, and by the time the Germans finally accepted that there would be no second invasion at Calais, it was late July, and the war in France was already lost. The Ghost Army's greatest achievement wasn't fooling Hitler on June 6th. It was keeping him fooled for 50 days after the invasion, holding German reserves in the wrong place for 7 critical weeks, while American, British, and Canadian forces consolidated their position in Normandy. Deception didn't just enable the invasion, it won the campaign. Private John Steele felt the C-47 shudder as it crossed the French coast at 1,000 feet. It was 11:45 on the night of June 5th, 1944, and he was carrying 120 pounds of equipment strapped to a body that normally weighed 160. The parachute pack pressed against his back, the reserve chute dug into his chest. Extra ammunition, grenades, rations, water, and an entrenching tool hung from his webbing in places that guaranteed maximum discomfort. Around him, in the darkness, 18 other paratroopers from the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment sat in silence, each man absorbed in whatever thoughts come before, jumping from an airplane into enemy territory at night. Steele had done this in training dozens of times, but training jumps happened in daylight over friendly fields with medics waiting on the ground. This jump would happen in darkness over occupied France with German soldiers waiting instead. The crew chief held up 10 fingers, 10 minutes to the drop zone. Steele checked his static line one more time, knowing it wouldn't make any difference, but needing to touch something, to confirm something was real in this moment that felt like a fever dream. The plan for the American airborne assault on Normandy looked beautiful on paper and insane when explained to the men who would execute it. 13,000 paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would drop behind Utah Beach in the hours before dawn. Their mission was to seize the causeways leading inland from the beach, capture key bridges, and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast. The operation required precision navigation, perfect weather, and enemy cooperation in terms of not shooting at low-flying transport planes. It assumed that paratroopers would land in their designated drop zones, assemble into their units, and execute complex tactical missions in darkness in territory they'd never seen, except in aerial photographs. It assumed that C-47 transport planes could fly in tight formation through clouds and anti-aircraft fire, while maintaining exact airspeed and altitude. It assumed a lot of things that experienced airborne officers knew were unlikely, but Eisenhower had approved the plan because the alternative landing on Utah Beach without airborne support was worse. Someone had to secure those causeways. Someone had to stop German reinforcements. And the only troops capable of arriving before the beach landings were paratroopers. The cloud bank appeared without warning just after the C-47 seconds crossed the coast. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, commanding the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, felt his aircraft suddenly enveloped in grey nothing. Visibility dropped to zero. The tight formations that had crossed the channel began to break apart as pilots lost sight of the planes ahead and beside them. Radio discipline prevented communication about the weather. Each pilot made independent decisions about whether to climb above the clouds, descend below them, or push through. The result was chaos. 45 C-47 seconds carrying one battalion scattered across 15 miles of sky. Cole's own plane emerged from the clouds far off course, the pilot disoriented, the landmarks invisible in darkness. When the green light came on and Cole jumped, he had no idea where he was except that it was France and it was the wrong place. He landed hard in a field, alone, 25 miles from his designated drop zone. For the next 2 hours, he walked through Norman hedgerows looking for anyone from his regiment, finding nobody, wondering if the invasion had already failed. The 82nd Airborne's drop across the Cotentin Peninsula created a pattern that resembled a shotgun blast more than a military deployment. Paratroopers landed in fields, roads, trees, rivers, and German positions across a 25-mile radius. Some landed within 100 yards of their drop zones and executed their missions exactly as planned. Others landed 35 miles away and spent days trying to find their units. Many landed in the swamps that Rommel had created specifically to drown them, weighted down by equipment, tangled in parachute harnesses, drowning in 4 feet of water that they couldn't see in the darkness. The Pathfinder teams that were supposed to mark drop zones with lights and radio beacons were themselves scattered. Some zones had no markers. Some markers were in the wrong places. Pilots released their paratroopers when they saw what they thought was the correct landmark. But at night, from 1,000 feet, one Norman village looks remarkably like another. By 2 in the morning, only 2,500 of 13,000 paratroopers had assembled in their correct units. The rest were scattered, lost, alone, or dead. What looked like a catastrophic failure from the American perspective looked even worse from the German side, and that was the accidental genius of the chaos. Wilhelm Falley, commander of the German 91st Air Landing Division, positioned behind Utah Beach, began receiving reports of paratroopers at 2 in the morning. Paratroopers at St. Mère-Église, paratroopers near Carrington, paratroopers at Pont-l'Abbé, paratroopers everywhere. His staff plotted the contacts on maps and saw no pattern, no concentration, no clear main effort. Was this a full-scale airborne invasion or a series of small raids? Where was the main force? Which contacts should he respond to? Falley had rehearsed counterattacks against concentrated airborne drops, but he'd never trained for paratroopers scattered across 200 square miles reporting in from everywhere simultaneously. He made the worst possible decision. He tried to respond to everything. His division fragmented into company and platoon-sized reaction forces racing toward reported contact points, finding nothing or finding small groups of Americans who melted back into the darkness. By dawn, the 91st Division was as scattered as the American paratroopers, chasing phantoms while the real threats consolidated. Sainte-Mère-Église became the first French town liberated from Nazi occupation through a combination of luck, courage, and confusion. The 505th Regiment's mission was to capture the town with 600 paratroopers landing in fields to the north and south. Instead, planes carrying one company overflew the designated drop zones and released their paratroopers directly over the town centre. Men descended into a nightmare. A barn was burning, and civilians were in the streets helping German soldiers fight the fire. Paratroopers fell into the firelight, where they were visible for hundreds of yards. German soldiers shot them as they descended. Some landed on buildings and were shot while trying to cut away their harnesses. Private John Steele's parachute caught on the church steeple, leaving him hanging from the tower, playing dead for 2 hours while gunfire tore through the streets below. But enough paratroopers landed in darkness outside the town to regroup. By 2:30 in the morning, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss led 180 men into Sainte-Mère-Église from the north and south simultaneously. The surprised German garrison fell back after brief but vicious street fighting. Krauss raised an American flag in the town square at 4 in the morning. The number was wrong. The method was improvised. But the mission was accomplished. Equipment bundles created their own problem within the problem. Each C-47 dropped not just paratroopers, but equipment bundles containing mortars, machine guns, ammunition, radios, and medical supplies. These bundles descended on separate parachutes and were supposed to land near their units. Instead, 60% of the bundles landed in swamps, rivers, German positions, or places nobody could find in the darkness. Entire units assembled without their heavy weapons. Companies had no radios to communicate with battalion. Battalion commanders had no way to coordinate their dispersed units. Medical supplies landed miles from wounded men who needed them. Some paratroopers spent the first hours of D-Day searching for equipment instead of executing missions. Others improvised with captured German weapons and ammunition. The breakdown in equipment delivery forced squad leaders and platoon commanders to make independent decisions about how to accomplish missions without the tools they'd trained with. Some missions became impossible without the missing equipment. Others succeeded through improvisation that would never have been attempted if everything had gone according to plan. The story of the Mézières Bridge revealed both the disaster and the strange success of the airborne operation. The 101st Airborne assigned 120 men from the 501st Regiment to capture the bridge intact. The bridge was critical, one of only a few crossings over the Douve River, essential for moving reinforcements from Carentan toward the beaches. The Germans knew its value and had positioned guards and demolition charges. When the drop happened, only 6 paratroopers landed anywhere near the bridge. 6 men to accomplish a mission planned for 20 times that number. The 6, none of them officers, looked at each other in the darkness and decided to attack anyway. They crept to the bridge, killed the 3 German guards in close combat, cut the demolition wires, and held the crossing for 3 hours until more paratroopers arrived. The mission succeeded, but in a way that would have been unthinkable in the planning. No military academy would teach that. 6 men should attack a defended bridge. No doctrine would suggest that scattered privates should attempt missions designed for platoons. But the chaos of the drop forced exactly those kinds of decisions, and enough of them succeeded to matter. By 4 in the morning, the situation in the American airborne sector was simultaneously catastrophic and successful. Only 20% of paratroopers had reached their assigned objectives. Casualty rates from the drop were approaching 10% before a single shot was fired in combat. Most heavy equipment was lost. Communication between units was virtually non-existent. German forces were confused but beginning to react. From a conventional military perspective, the operation was failing. But from a strategic perspective, it was working. The scattered drops had paralyzed German decision-making by creating the impression of paratroopers everywhere. Key bridges and causeways were being held by ad hoc groups of survivors. Sainte-Mère-Église was secured. And, most importantly, German reinforcements that should have been moving toward Utah Beach were instead hunting scattered paratroopers across the interior. The cost was horrific. The execution was chaotic. But the airborne assault accomplished its essential mission. It created enough confusion and seized enough objectives to give the beach landings a chance. Sometimes victory doesn't look like the plan. Sometimes it looks like disaster that achieves the objective anyway. The midnight jump into Normandy became legendary not because it went well, but because it went terribly and succeeded anyway. The veterans who survived would spend decades trying to explain how an operation that violated every principle of airborne warfare somehow worked. The answer lay not in superior planning or execution, but in adaptability under impossible circumstances. When 13,000 men jump from planes into darkness over enemy territory and land everywhere except where they're supposed to be, 2 things can happen. They can collapse into confusion and accomplish nothing, or they can adapt, improvise, and accomplish missions in ways nobody planned. The American paratroopers chose the latter. Officers led whatever troops they found regardless of unit. Privates executed missions meant for captains. Scattered groups attacked objectives they stumbled upon rather than the ones they were assigned. The command structure collapsed, and in its place emerged something more dangerous: thousands of armed, trained soldiers making independent decisions about how to hurt the enemy. The Germans prepared for a conventional airborne assault with clear drop zones and organised units. Instead, they faced something that looked like chaos but fought like an army. By dawn on June 6th, the airborne gamble had paid off in ways nobody expected. The beach landings would happen in hours. and the paratroopers had done their job. They'd cleared the way. Not according to plan, but despite the plan. Not with precision, but with courage. And that, it turned out, was enough. The landing craft ramp dropped at 6:32 in the morning, and Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment learned that everything they'd been told was wrong. The intelligence briefing said German defences on Dog Green sector of Omaha Beach were moderate. They said aerial bombardment would crater the bunkers. They said naval gunfire would suppress the machine guns. They said specialised tanks would land ahead of the infantry and clear the obstacles. They said a lot of things that turned out to be catastrophically incorrect. What greeted Company A was a beach completely intact, defences fully manned, and machine gun fire so intense that the water churned white with bullet impacts. The first men off the ramp died before their boots touched sand. The second and third lines died trying to climb over the bodies. By 6:34, 90 seconds after the ramp dropped, Company A had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Of 197 men in the company, 187 were dead or wounded. The survivors huddled behind beach obstacles that provided no real cover, pinned down by fire they couldn't see, taking casualties from weapons they couldn't locate, trapped between drowning in the incoming tide and dying on the beach. This was Omaha, and it had only just begun. The intelligence failure that created the Omaha catastrophe was comprehensive and devastating. Allied planners believed the beach was defended by a single German regiment, the 716th Infantry, a static coastal defence unit composed primarily of ageing reservists and foreign conscripts. What they didn't know was that the German 352nd Infantry Division had moved into the Omaha sector weeks before the invasion as part of a routine rotation. The 352nd wasn't a coastal defence unit. It was a veteran combat division that had fought in Russia, survived the Eastern Front, and deployed to France for rest and refit. 7,000 experienced soldiers with excellent weapons, well-trained officers, and intimate knowledge of their defensive positions now occupied fortifications that Allied intelligence believed were barely manned. How did the Allies miss an entire division? The answer was a combination of poor photo reconnaissance, over-reliance on French resistance reports from the wrong sectors, and simple bad luck. The 352nd moved into position during a period of bad weather that grounded reconnaissance flights. By the time the skies cleared, it was too late to change the landing plan. 116,000 men were already loading onto ships with intelligence that was fatally incorrect. The pre-invasion bombardment that was supposed to destroy the German defences accomplished almost nothing. 329 B-24 Liberator bombers dropped. 13,000 bombs on Omaha Beach before dawn on June 6th. In theory, that much explosive would obliterate bunkers, crater the beach, and leave defenders too stunned to fight. In practice, the bombardment was executed in total darkness through heavy cloud cover with orders to delay bomb release to avoid hitting the incoming landing craft. Bombardiers couldn't see their targets. They released their loads based on instrument navigation and timing, adding a safety delay of several seconds to ensure they didn't hit the ships offshore. The result was that 13,000 bombs fell inland, behind the beach, hitting Norman cow pastures instead of German bunkers. Not a single bomb hit the beach fortifications. Naval gunfire lasted only 40 minutes before the landing craft approached, not nearly long enough to neutralise hardened concrete positions. The destroyers fired from long range to avoid shallow water. Their shells struck cliffs and earthworks but rarely penetrated the bunkers, where German machine gunners waited, undamaged, alert, and ready. The D.D. Sherman tanks that were supposed to land ahead of the infantry and provide covering fire never made it to the beach. The initials D.D. stood for Duplex Drive, a British innovation that fitted standard Sherman tanks with propellers and inflatable canvas screens, theoretically allowing them to swim from ships to shore. In calm water, in daylight, with ideal conditions, the D.D. tanks worked acceptably. In 10-foot seas, in darkness, launched 3 miles offshore, they were death traps. The canvas screens collapsed under wave pressure. Water poured over the engine decks. The tanks that weighed 33 tons sank in minutes, taking their crews with them. Of the 32 D.D. tanks launched offshore on Omaha, 27 sank before reaching the beach. The crews drowned, strapped into their positions, or died of hypothermia in the 50-degree water. Only 5 tanks reached the beach intact, and they arrived after the initial infantry waves were already being slaughtered. The armor support that the landing plan depended on simply didn't exist. The infantry hit the beach alone, facing bunkers and machine guns with nothing but rifles and a prayer. The 16th Engineer Special Brigade had the mission nobody wanted: clear the beach obstacles under fire. They were supposed to land immediately after the first infantry waves, blow gaps through the obstacles with explosives, and mark safe lanes for follow-up craft. They trained for months to execute this mission in 30 minutes. The training never simulated what they encountered on Omaha: every landing craft off course by hundreds of yards, obstacles covered by intense machine gun fire, wounded and dead infantry using the same obstacles for cover that the engineers needed to destroy. Engineers worked in teams of 16 men. Each team needed 5 minutes of uninterrupted work to place charges on a 50-yard section of obstacles. On Omaha, teams were taking casualties before they could even unload their explosives. Men were shot while carrying satchel charges, causing sympathetic detonations that killed entire teams. Others were pinned down by fire so intense they couldn't move. By 9 in the morning, the engineers had suffered 41% casualties and had cleared exactly 6 partial gaps in the obstacles. The plan called for 16 complete gaps. Landing craft continued arriving, hitting mines because there were no marked lanes, adding wreckage to obstacles that were already impassable. German machine gunners in strongpoint WN62 had what professional soldiers call a target-rich environment. From their positions on the bluff overlooking Omaha Beach, they had unobstructed fields of fire covering 1,200 yards of beach. Each MG-42 machine gun could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, and the gun positions had been sited specifically to create interlocking fields of fire with no dead space. The gunners didn't need to aim carefully. They simply traversed their weapons back and forth across the beach in sweeping arcs. At that rate of fire, hitting individual soldiers was almost irrelevant. The volume of fire was so intense that being in its path was fatal regardless of cover or movement. The American infantry doctrine for beach assault called for soldiers to sprint across the beach, get off the killing ground, and assault the bluffs. That doctrine assumed they could cross the beach. On Omaha, men who stood up died, men who ran died faster. The only survival strategy was to stay flat against the sand behind whatever cover existed and wait for something to change. For 3 hours, nothing changed except the casualty count. General Norman Cotter reached Omaha Beach at 7:30 in the morning and found a situation that no battle plan had prepared him for. He was Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, which meant he was supposed to be coordinating regiment-level operations from a command post. Instead, he was wading through waist-deep water, past bodies floating in the surf, past burning landing craft, past wounded men calling for medics who were themselves casualties. The beach was covered with soldiers taking cover behind obstacles, many of them not even returning fire because exposing themselves to shoot was suicide. Cotter moved along the beach shouting at companies and platoons that had ceased to function as organised units. His words became famous, the kind of profane, direct leadership that transforms moments. 2 kinds of people are staying on this beach, he shouted. Those who are dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here. He didn't order men forward. He led them forward. He found a gap in the wire at the base of the bluff, where German fire was slightly less intense. He climbed through it with 5 men carrying grenades. They cleared one machine gun position, then another. Small groups of infantry saw an officer doing what they'd been trained to do and followed, not because of orders, but because someone showed it was possible. The breakthrough on Omaha Beach happened in 29 different places simultaneously, and not one of them was in the plan. While senior commanders offshore debated whether to evacuate the beach, junior officers and NCOs were making the decision for them by attacking. A lieutenant from the 2nd Rangers found a fishing trail up the bluff and led 18 men up it in single file, emerging behind German positions. A captain from the 16th Infantry organised 40 men from 3 different companies and assaulted a gun position frontally with grenades and bayonets. A sergeant from the 29th Division used Bangalore torpedoes, tubes of explosives designed to clear wire to blow a hole through a minefield, and led a platoon through it. None of these actions were coordinated. None of them followed the plan. They happened because individual leaders decided that dying while attacking was preferable to dying while hiding. By 10 in the morning, 29 separate small unit actions had penetrated the German defence line at different points. The penetrations were shallow, fragile, and unsupported, but they existed, and they were enough. The destroyers saved Omaha Beach by violating every rule of naval gunnery. Standard doctrine kept destroyers at least 2,000 yards offshore to avoid running aground. The destroyers USS McCook and USS Carmack ignored the doctrine at 11 in the morning and drove directly toward the beach, coming within 800 yards of shore in water so shallow their keels were scraping bottom. From that range, they could see individual bunkers and machine gun nests. They fired directly at them with 5-inch guns designed for anti-aircraft work. The Germans had never planned for direct naval fire support because they assumed ships couldn't get close enough. The assumption was wrong. The destroyer fire was devastatingly accurate at close range. Bunkers that had withstood battleship shells from 6 miles away were destroyed by destroyer guns at point-blank range. German defenders pulled back from coastal positions into reserve lines inland. The withdrawal was tactical and temporary, but it created a window. For 30 minutes, the fire slackened enough that American infantry could move. They didn't wait for orders, they moved. By noon on June 6th, Omaha Beach was the site of one of the bloodiest battles in American military history, and it wasn't over. 2,400 Americans were dead, wounded, or missing. Entire companies had been annihilated. The beach was covered with destroyed equipment and bodies. Landing craft continued to arrive with reinforcements who added to the casualties or to the breakthrough force depending on where they landed. German strongpoints inland continued fighting. Artillery fire still hit the beach intermittently, but the situation had fundamentally changed. Americans held the bluffs in multiple places. Engineers were clearing additional gaps in the obstacles. Tanks were finally getting ashore. Medical teams were setting up aid stations. And most importantly, the Germans had lost their only chance to throw the invasion back into the sea. The breakthrough happened not because of superior planning or overwhelming force, but because hundreds of junior officers and NCOs refused to accept defeat. They led small unit actions that accomplished nothing individually but collectively created momentum. Senior officers offshore thought Omaha might fail. The soldiers on the beach didn't know they weren't supposed to succeed. So they did it anyway. 1 bunker, 1 machine gun nest, 1 yard of ground at a time. By nightfall, 34,000 troops were ashore at Omaha. The cost was horrific. The victory was incomplete. But the beach was held. And that meant the invasion would continue. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. stood in the surf at 6:31 in the morning and realized that every single landing craft in the first wave had come ashore in the wrong place. Roosevelt was 56 years old, walked with a cane because of a heart condition and arthritis, and had argued forcefully with his division commander for permission to land with the first assault wave. His presence on the beach was irregular. Brigadier generals were supposed to command from headquarters, not wade ashore with rifle companies. But Roosevelt insisted that someone of rank needed to be on the beach immediately to make decisions, and now he understood why. The landmarks were wrong. The distinctive church steeple that was supposed to be directly inland wasn't visible. The beach itself looked different from the aerial photographs. Tidal currents and smoke from naval bombardment had pushed the entire first wave 2,000 yards south of the intended landing point. Roosevelt had about 3 minutes to make a decision before the next waves landed. Should he order all follow-up waves to land at the correct beach, 2,000 yards north, or commit everything to this wrong location? The wrong choice would create chaos and possibly disaster. He chose quickly. "We'll start the war from right here," he told the naval officers. It was the luckiest mistake of D-Day. The landing at Utah Beach was supposed to be the secondary effort, the supporting operation to the main landings at Omaha. The planners allocated fewer troops, less naval support, and accepted higher risk because they needed Utah's beaches to build up forces quickly for the drive to Cherbourg. The beach selected for the assault was designated because it had the best tank exits and was closest to the airborne drop zones inland. The defences looked formidable: concrete bunkers, beach obstacles, minefields. Intelligence estimated a reinforced German regiment defending the sector, similar strength to Omaha. The plan called for precision landing at low tide when obstacles were exposed, with combat engineers clearing the beach in the first hour. What the plan didn't account for was the basic chaos of amphibious warfare: tides, currents, smoke, fear, and navigation errors that could place troops anywhere within miles of their intended beaches. The current that morning ran parallel to the coast at nearly 2 knots. Landing craft that spent 40 minutes crossing from ships to shore drifted 2,000 yards during the approach. every single craft in the first wave, the wrong beach turned out to be the right beach in ways nobody could have predicted. The intended landing site was designated because it offered the best causeways inland. But those causeways were also obvious choke points that the Germans had heavily fortified. The beach 2,000 yards south had fewer causeways, but also significantly weaker defences. The German troops in that sector were a hodgepodge of units, some coastal defence troops, some Eastern European conscripts, some teenagers pulled from reserve. The bunkers were smaller and more spread out. The mine density was lower. Most critically, the positions hadn't been reinforced with the veteran troops that held the originally planned landing site. When the first American troops came ashore, they encountered scattered resistance instead of concentrated fire. German defenders were surprised the landing was occurring outside the sector they were prepared to defend. The Americans were equally surprised that they weren't dying in large numbers. For the first 30 minutes, both sides were confused, but only one side had overwhelming numbers arriving by the minute. The 4th Infantry Division came ashore at Utah with a precision and efficiency that would have been impossible at the correct beach. Company after company landed, assembled, and moved inland, following Roosevelt, who personally led troops off the beach with his cane in one hand and a pistol in the other. The combat engineers found fewer obstacles than expected and cleared lanes quickly. The beach obstacles that did exist were often unmanned or poorly positioned. D.D. Sherman tanks that had been disaster at Omaha worked perfectly at Utah. The seas were calmer in this sector, and many tanks swam all the way to shore. Those that were launched too far offshore were picked up by landing craft and brought in directly. By 7:30, barely an hour after the first landing, tank infantry teams were operating inland, clearing bunkers and pushing toward the causeways. The expected nightmare of beach obstacles, mines, and concentrated fire never materialized because the landing happened where the Germans were weakest instead of where they were strongest. The link-up with the airborne forces became the primary mission once the beach was secured. Scattered paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd Airborne were holding towns and crossroads inland, fighting desperately against German counterattacks. If the beach forces didn't reach them quickly, the paratroopers would be overwhelmed. Roosevelt and the 4th Division commanders pushed inland aggressively, knowing that every hour of delay increased casualties among the airborne. The 4th Cavalry Squadron raced toward Pooperville, a small village held by scattered paratroopers who'd been fighting since 3 in the morning. When the cavalry arrived at 8 in the morning, they found 43 paratroopers alive out of an original force of 120, ammunition nearly exhausted, but still holding. The link-up was emotional and immediate. Beach and airborne forces were connected. Utah Beach was no longer an isolated toehold, but a genuine invasion corridor. By 11:30 in the morning, Utah Beach had accomplished objectives that weren't supposed to be reached until the end of the first day. Troops had pushed 3 miles inland, the deepest penetration of D-Day on any beach. Causeway Exit 2 was captured intact, allowing vehicles to move inland immediately instead of backing up on the beach. Tank infantry teams had cleared most of the coastal strongpoints. Casualties were astonishingly light, 197 men killed, wounded, or missing compared to over 2,000 at Omaha. 23,000 troops were ashore by the end of the first day, more than planned. The supplies and equipment that was supposed to arrive over 3 days arrived in 1. From a military perspective, Utah was a nearly perfect amphibious operation. The irony was that it succeeded because nothing went according to plan. The lucky beach wasn't lucky because of superior preparation or execution. It was lucky because fundamental errors in navigation placed troops in a weaker sector of German defences than anyone intended. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. never knew how his decision to start the war from right here changed the course of the invasion. He continued leading from the front for 37 more days, personally leading assaults, reconnoitering positions, and inspiring troops through personal example. On July 12, 1944, he died of a heart attack in his tent 37 days after wading ashore at Utah Beach with a cane and a pistol. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, the only general officer on D-Day to receive the decoration. The citation mentioned his courage under fire and his decision to land the entire division at the wrong beach, a decision that military historians would debate for decades. Was it brilliant improvisation or fortunate accident? The answer doesn't matter as much as the outcome. Because of Roosevelt's decision, Utah Beach became the success story of D-Day. The beach where everything worked, the place where American forces established a lodgment with minimal casualties and maximum speed. The contrast between Omaha and Utah haunted American commanders for the rest of the war. Two beaches, 10 miles apart, attacking the same German army with identical objectives. At one beach, catastrophe. At the other, success. The difference wasn't in training, equipment, or courage. The soldiers at both beaches were equally prepared and equally brave. The difference was in German defensive strength, which was determined by factors beyond American control: tidal currents, navigation errors, and the accident of where stronger units happened to be positioned. War plans try to control these variables, but amphibious assault is inherently chaotic. Success often depends less on perfect execution than on whether the chaos works in your favor. At Omaha, every variable went wrong simultaneously: poor intelligence, missed bombardment, lost tanks, strong defenses. At Utah, enough variables went right: navigation errors, landing troops in weaker defenses, successful tank deployment, quick link up with Airborne to create success. The lesson was uncomfortable for military planners who wanted to believe that success came from superior planning. Sometimes it came from luck, and sometimes luck mattered more than planning. The Lucky Beach nickname stuck with Utah veterans, and they spent the rest of their lives trying to explain that luck wasn't the whole story. Yes, they landed in the wrong place. Yes, the defenses were weaker than expected, but they still had to fight their way off a defended beach, still had to clear bunkers and machine gun nests, still had to execute complex infantry armor coordination under fire. The low casualty count wasn't because Germans didn't fight, it was because American units executed their missions quickly and aggressively before German reinforcements could arrive. Roosevelt's leadership mattered. The 4th Division's training mattered. The engineers clearing obstacles mattered. All of it mattered. But the veterans also knew that if the tides had been different, if the current hadn't pushed them south, if they'd landed where they were supposed to land, Utah might have looked like Omaha. They knew they'd been fortunate. They also knew that fortune favors units that are prepared to exploit it. Utah Beach succeeded because when luck gave them an opening, they didn't hesitate. They attacked through it before the opportunity closed. By nightfall on June 6th, Utah Beach was secure, and the 4th Infantry Division was already pushing toward Carrington and Cherbourg. The contrast with Omaha couldn't have been starker. While troops at Omaha were still consolidating their desperate foothold, troops at Utah were asking for orders to continue the advance. Logistically, Utah became the primary entry point for men and materiel in the American sector. The beaches stayed open and functional, while Omaha struggled with casualties and wreckage. The ease of the Utah landing created momentum that carried into the following days. Units moved inland faster, secured more ground, and linked up with airborne forces more completely than anywhere else. On D-Day, if the invasion had a model for how amphibious assault was supposed to work, Utah was it. The fact that the model succeeded through navigation error rather than perfect execution didn't make the success less real. It simply made the lessons more complex. Sometimes the best laid plans go wrong in exactly the right way. Sometimes we'll start the war from right here is better than following the plan. And sometimes the luckiest decision is the one made by a 56-year-old general with a cane and heart condition who decided that being in the wrong place was better than not being there at all. The paratroopers holding Sainte-Mère-Église could hear the battle coming toward them before they could see it. It was 2 p.m. on June 6, 1944, and the 180 men from the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment had been fighting for 12 hours straight. They'd captured the town at dawn, killed or captured the German garrison, and immediately faced counterattacks from 3 directions. Now they were low on ammunition, completely out of anti-tank weapons, and receiving reports that German armour was approaching from the south. At the same time, they could hear different sounds coming from the North American sounds: the distinctive crack of M1 Garand rifles, the heavier thump of 30 caliber machine guns, the voices shouting in English. The 4th Infantry Division was fighting its way up the coastal road from Utah Beach, and the race was on. Would the beach forces reach the surrounded paratroopers before German reinforcements crushed them? The next 6 hours would determine whether the American sector held together or fractured into isolated pockets that could be destroyed one at a time. The strategic importance of linking Utah Beach with the airborne forces was simple to understand and desperately difficult to execute. The paratroopers held key terrain towns, bridges, road junctions, but they were scattered, low on ammunition, and fighting against growing German counterattacks. The beach forces had overwhelming numbers and supplies but were compressed into a narrow coastal strip with limited exit routes. If the two forces connected, they would create a continuous 10-mile-deep lodgment that could absorb German counterattacks and support offensive operations toward Cherbourg. If they failed to connect, the Germans could defeat them separately. The paratroopers would be overrun, the beach forces would be contained, and the entire invasion in the American sector could fail. Eisenhower and Bradley knew this, the German commanders knew this, and the soldiers fighting toward each other through Norman hedgerows knew this. The race to link up wasn't about capturing ground for strategic purposes, it was about survival. The 4th Infantry Division's advance from Utah Beach looked methodical on maps and chaotic on the ground. Companies moved cross-country through hedgerows that compartmentalized the battlefield into hundreds of small, separate fights. Each hedgerow could hide a German machine gun team, each field could contain a minefield, each farmhouse could be a strong point or an empty building. There was no way to know without clearing it. The advance toward Sainte-Mère-Église required moving through 3 miles of this terrain against scattered but determined German resistance. Tank infantry teams that had worked smoothly on the beach became disjointed inland. Tanks couldn't see over hedgerows. Infantry couldn't advance without tank support. German defenders developed tactics specifically for hedgerow, fighting fire a few shots, fall back to the next hedgerow, repeat. It slowed the American advance to a crawl. Every field took 30 minutes to clear. Every hedgerow required artillery support or grenades. By noon, the 4th Division had covered less than a mile. The German 1057th Regiment counterattacked Sainte-Mère-Église from the east at 10 in the morning with 2,200 men against the 350 paratroopers holding the town. The Germans had infantry, artillery support, and clear numerical superiority. What they didn't have was time. The regimental commander knew that American beach forces were approaching from the north. If his attack bogged down, his regiment would be caught between two forces. So he attacked aggressively, pushing into the town's outskirts, forcing the paratroopers back into defensive positions around the town centre. House-to-house fighting raged through the morning. Paratroopers ran low on ammunition and scavenged rounds from dead Germans and Americans alike. Medics treated wounded in the town church while gunfire echoed off stone walls. The parish priest, hiding in the basement, would later describe hearing American and German voices shouting at each other between bursts of gunfire, each side calling for the other's surrender, neither side giving ground. The Battle of Neuville-aux-Plaines happened simultaneously 5 miles to the south and illustrated the chaos of the first 48 hours. The 82nd Airborne held the village with a mixed force of 350 men from 4 different regiments who'd found each other in the darkness and decided to defend together. German reconnaissance detected them at dawn and called in artillery. By 10 in the morning, a full German regiment, the same strength that was attacking Sainte-Mère-Église, assaulted Neuville with infantry and armour. The paratroopers had no anti-tank weapons heavier than bazookas, no artillery support, and no way to call for help because their radios were lost in the drop. They fought with rifles, grenades, and desperation. Every German attack penetrated the village, every American counterattack threw them out. Buildings changed hands 3 and 4 times. By 2 in the morning, the village was in ruins, 50% of the defenders were casualties, and the Germans still hadn't broken through. A lieutenant from the 508th Regiment later described it as the longest day of my life, fighting the same battle over and over in the same village against an enemy that wouldn't quit. The link-up finally happened at 4:30 in the afternoon, when lead elements of the 8th Infantry Regiment entered Sainte-Mère-Église from the north. The meeting was less dramatic than anyone expected, exhausted soldiers from both forces simply nodding at each other, too tired for celebration, immediately turning to the tactical problem of holding what they'd connected. But the significance was enormous. Utah Beach and the Airborne forces were joined. Supplies could flow from the beach to the paratroopers. Reinforcements could move inland. Medical evacuation could move wounded back to the beach. Most importantly, the lodgment was now continuous and 10 miles deep. The Germans could no longer isolate and destroy the scattered airborne. Pockets. The strategic race was won. The tactical fighting would continue for days, but the outcome was decided in that moment when beach and airborne forces shook hands in a destroyed French town. The Carentan Causeway became the next critical objective because it was the only direct connection between Utah and Omaha beaches. The town of Carentan, sat at the junction of the two American beach sectors, connected to the coast by a single elevated causeway running through flooded marshland. The 101st Airborne was tasked with capturing it, which meant attacking down a mile-long causeway with no cover, no concealment, and swamps on both sides, preventing any flanking movement. The German 6th Parachute Regiment defended the causeway with veteran troops who understood that if they held it, they could keep the two American beaches separated. The fight for the causeway lasted from June 7th through June 13th and cost the 101st Airborne 40% casualties. Companies that started with 150 men finished with 60. The Germans defended every foot of causeway, every building in Carentan, every street corner. American artillery and air support helped, but ultimately the battle came down to infantry, fighting infantry at close range with no room for manoeuvre. By June 8th, 3 days after the invasion, the American position in Normandy had transformed from tenuous to established. The Utah Beach Forces and Airborne had created a continuous lodgement stretching from the coast to 15 miles inland. The Omaha and Utah sectors had finally linked up after the brutal Carentan fight. 326,000 troops were ashore across all the American, British, and Canadian beaches. The immediate crisis, whether the invasion would be thrown back into the sea, was over. But a new problem emerged that was less dramatic but equally important. Supplies weren't arriving fast enough. The plan called for specific tonnages of ammunition, fuel, and food to be landed each day. The actual numbers were running 60% of plan. The Great Storm had destroyed one artificial harbour. Cherbourg wasn't captured yet, and the logistics tail stretched back to England with no intermediate supply base. The armies could advance, but how far could they go when trucks were running out of fuel and artillery batteries were rationing shells? The German 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division received orders to counterattack the American lodgement on June 8th, but they couldn't reach the battlefield. Allied air interdiction and French resistance sabotage had turned the road network into a gauntlet. Every bridge the division needed to cross had been bombed. Every rail line was cut. Resistance fighters attacked supply columns and ambushed motorcycle couriers. Allied fighter bombers prowled the roads during daylight, attacking anything that moved. The division that was supposed to reach Normandy in 24 hours took 72 hours and arrived piecemeal, units scattered across 50 miles, never achieving the concentrated force needed for effective counterattack. By the time the lead elements reached combat, the American position was consolidated enough to absorb the attack. The race to link up had been won not just by American forces connecting with each other, but by preventing German forces from concentrating fast enough to separate them. The 48 hours between D-Day and June 8th represented the most dangerous period of the entire Normandy campaign. The Allies were ashore but not yet consolidated. The Germans were in position but not yet coordinating effective counterattacks. Everything was fluid, chaotic, and undecided. Small unit actions determined large strategic outcomes. A platoon holding a bridge prevented a battalion from advancing. A company taking a crossroads opened an entire sector for exploitation. Commanders on both sides were making decisions, with incomplete information, unable to see the whole battlefield, trusting junior officers to make the right choices in the chaos. The Americans won this period not through superior strategy, but through aggressive execution at every level. When there was doubt about whether to defend or attack, they attacked. When there was confusion about objectives, they moved forward until they found the enemy. The race to link up succeeded because enough small units won enough small fights to create momentum. And once that momentum existed, it became impossible for the Germans to stop. The lodgement was established, the race was won, and now the real battle for Normandy could begin. Erwin Rommel heard about the invasion on the radio while driving through Germany at 90 miles per hour. It was 10:30 in the morning on June 6th, 1944, and the Desert Fox was 300 miles from his command post in France. He'd gone home to give his wife a pair of shoes for her birthday on June 6th, convinced that weather would prevent any invasion attempt for at least a week. The radio report was fragmentary Allied landings in Normandy, paratroopers reported across wide areas, situation developing. Rommel ordered his driver to push the speed faster and spent the next 6 hours imagining worst-case scenarios. He'd inspected those beaches personally. He knew their strengths and fatal weaknesses. He knew that the first 24 hours would determine everything. He knew that mobile counterattacks by panzer divisions in the first day could throw the invasion back into the sea. And he knew that those panzer divisions could only move with Hitler's personal authorization that would have to come from Hitler's headquarters at Berchtesgaden, where Hitler was still asleep because his staff was afraid to wake him with bad news. The counterattack that could win or lose the war was being delayed because nobody wanted to disturb the Führer's rest. The German command structure in France on D-Day was designed to lose battles. Field Marshal von Rundstedt commanded all German forces in the West from his headquarters in Paris. Rommel commanded Army Group B, responsible for defending the coast from his headquarters in La Roche-Guyon. But neither commander could move the panzer divisions without authorization from Berlin. Hitler had personally reserved the right to deploy armour, paranoid that his generals would waste Germany's mobile reserves. This meant that when the invasion began, the two generals closest to the battle couldn't respond with their most powerful weapons. They could request permission, they could argue. They could explain that every hour of delay allowed the Allies to consolidate, but they couldn't act. Von Rundstedt requested permission to move the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division at 4 in the morning on June 6th. The request went to Hitler's headquarters. Hitler was asleep. His chief of staff refused to wake him. The request sat on a desk for 12 hours while Allied forces established their beachheads. The 12th SS Panzer Division finally received movement orders at 4 in the afternoon on June 6th, 12 hours after von Rundstedt's initial request. The delay was catastrophic. If the division had moved at dawn, it could have reached the invasion beaches by mid-morning, attacking American and British forces while they were still disorganized. Instead, it began moving in daylight, in clear weather, under skies controlled by Allied aircraft. Allied fighter bombers caught the division strung out on the roads. Typhoons, Thunderbolts, and Mustangs attacked the columns continuously. Tank transporters were destroyed, supply trucks burned, infantry units scattered into fields seeking cover. The division that was supposed to concentrate for a decisive counterattack fragmented into scattered company-sized groups hiding in woods during daylight, moving at night, never achieving the mass needed for effective attack. By the time lead elements reached the combat zone on June 8th, 60 hours after the invasion began, they were too late. The beachheads were established. The moment for throwing the Allies back into the sea had passed. Panzer Lehr Division suffered even worse. It was one of Germany's elite formations, 14,800 men, experienced tank crews, veterans from North Africa and Russia. The division began moving toward Normandy on June 7th and immediately came under devastating air attack. Allied pilots had been briefed specifically about German armour moving toward the battlefield. They knew what panzer columns looked like from altitude. They attacked relentlessly. Panzer Lehr's commander, Fritz Bayerlein, later testified that his division was under continuous air attack for 16 hours. 5,000 of 14,000 men became casualties before the division even reached combat. 80% of the division's tanks and vehicles were destroyed or damaged. Artillery pieces were abandoned on the roads. Supply columns were incinerated. When Panzer Lehr finally deployed for counterattack on June 10th, it was a shattered formation incapable of offensive operations. The counterattack that was supposed to split the Allied beachhead and reach the sea never happened because the division ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force during its approach march. The counterattack at Nory-en-Bessin on June 9th showed what German armour could still accomplish when it actually reached the battlefield, and why even successful tactical actions couldn't change the strategic reality. The 12th SS Panzer Division hit British and Canadian positions south of Caen with 200 tanks and supporting infantry. The attack was aggressive, well coordinated, and initially successful. German tanks penetrated 3 miles, overran defensive positions, and threatened to break through to the beaches. For 6 hours, the outcome was uncertain. Then, Allied naval gunfire joined the battle. Destroyers and cruisers offshore fired in support of ground forces, something German commanders hadn't experienced before and couldn't counter. 150 naval guns poured shells into German assembly areas. Artillery observers on the ground directed fire onto German tanks with devastating accuracy. The counterattack stalled under the naval bombardment, German tanks withdrew, and the penetration was sealed. The lesson was clear: even Germany's best units couldn't operate effectively under Allied naval and air supremacy. The material advantage was simply too great. The German 77th Infantry Division's counterattack at Carentan on June 13th represented Germany's last serious attempt to separate the American beaches. The division attacked with 8,000 men against elements of the 101st Airborne holding the town. The Germans knew that Carentan was the junction between Utah and Omaha beaches. If they recaptured it, they could isolate the two American sectors and defeat them separately. The attack began at dawn, with heavy artillery preparation followed by infantry assault from three directions. American paratroopers, already exhausted from days of continuous combat, fell back into the town centre. By 10 in the morning, German forces were in Carentan's outskirts. Combat Command A of the 2nd Armoured Division counterattacked from the north at 11:30. The American armour hit the German flank with 60 Sherman tanks and supporting infantry. The German attack collapsed within 2 hours. By 2 in the afternoon, the 77th Division was retreating with 30% casualties. It was the last time German forces would threaten to separate the American beaches. Hitler's personal involvement in tactical decisions destroyed any possibility of effective German response. He refused to accept that Normandy was the main invasion, convinced that a larger force would still land past Calais. This belief kept the 15th Army 19 divisions sitting uselessly at Calais through June. When his generals requested permission to withdraw from Caen to establish a better defensive line, Hitler refused, demanding that every metre of ground be held. When Rommel suggested pulling back to create mobile reserves for counterattacks, Hitler ordered that all positions be defended in place. The Führer's interference turned German strategy from flexible defence into static attrition warfare, exactly the kind of fight that favoured the Allies' material superiority. German commanders could see the invasion succeeding and could identify the strategic responses that might stop it, but they couldn't implement those responses without permission that never came or came too late to matter. By June 13th, 1 week after D-Day, the German opportunity to defeat the invasion had conclusively passed. 557,000 Allied troops were ashore, compared to 350,000 Germans defending all of Normandy. The Allies were landing supplies faster than the Germans could bring up reserves. Air supremacy meant German movement happened at night, while Allied forces moved during the day. Naval gunfire gave the Allies mobile artillery that German forces couldn't match or counter. Most critically, Germany's mobile reserves, the panzer divisions that were supposed to be the counterattack force, had been destroyed or crippled during their approach marches. The 12th SS Panzer and Panzer Lehr divisions that might have thrown the invasion back on June 6th were shattered by June 13th. They would continue fighting, but they would never again have the strength to conduct decisive offensive operations. The window for counterattack had closed. Germany was now fighting to contain the beachhead, not to eliminate it. And containment was a losing strategy against an enemy landing thousands of tons of supplies daily. Rommel understood the strategic reality before anyone else in the German command structure. In mid-June, he wrote to his wife, describing the situation in terms that would have been considered defeatist by Nazi standards. He explained that Allied material superiority was overwhelming, that German forces couldn't move during daylight, that reinforcements were being destroyed before reaching the front, that the battle was being lost. He didn't write these things because he'd given up. He wrote them because he was a professional soldier assessing the battlefield honestly. The Allies had won the race to build up forces faster than Germany could respond. They'd won because their deception operations kept German reserves in the wrong place. They'd won because air and naval power prevented German reinforcements from reaching Normandy intact. And they'd won because Hitler's command structure prevented flexible response during the critical first 72 hours. The counterattacks that might have saved Normandy never happened at the right time or with adequate force. And now the question wasn't whether Germany could throw the Allies back into the sea. The question was whether Germany could hold them in Normandy long enough to make the campaign so costly that the Allies would negotiate peace. It was the wrong question, but it was the only one German commanders could still ask. The failure of German counterattacks in the first 2 weeks of June determined the outcome of the Normandy campaign and arguably shortened the war by a year. If Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS Panzer had reached the beaches on June 6th or 7th with their full strength, if they'd hit the tenuous American positions at Omaha or the scattered paratroopers inland, the invasion might have been contained or even defeated. The margin was that thin. But the combination of Allied deception, air superiority, naval gunfire, and Hitler's incompetent command structure prevented effective German response during the critical window. By the time German armour reached Normandy in force, the Allies were too strong to dislodge. The counterattack that could have changed history never materialised. And the soldiers who died in scattered company-sized attacks over 2 weeks might have won a decisive victory if they'd been allowed to attack together in the first 24 hours. War is often decided not by what happens, but by what doesn't happen when it should. Germany's counterattacks in Normandy were a textbook example of opportunity lost through delay, confusion, and command incompetence. The Allies won the battle not just by what they did well, but by what the Germans failed to do at all. Lieutenant General J. Lawton Collins earned his nickname Lightning Joe in the Pacific, and he brought that aggressive mindset to Normandy with mixed results. It was June 14th, 1944, and Collins commanded 7 Corps with orders to drive north up the Cotentin Peninsula and capture Cherbourg. The plan looked simple on maps: cut across the peninsula base to isolate German forces, then drive north to the port. The reality was 40,000 German troops defending terrain that favoured defence, with orders from Hitler to fight to the last man and destroy everything before surrendering. Collins had 3 divisions, overwhelming artillery support and complete air superiority. What he didn't have was time. The Great Storm on June 19th had destroyed the American artificial harbour, which meant Cherbourg was no longer just strategically important, it was existentially necessary. Without a functioning port, the entire Allied logistics system would collapse. The drive for Cherbourg became a race against supply shortages, and the faster Collins pushed, the more his divisions bled. The German LXXIV Corps, defending the Cotentin Peninsula, knew they were doomed, but fought anyway because Wehrmacht doctrine and Nazi ideology demanded it. General Wilhelm Farnbacher commanded 40,000 troops, a mix of coastal defence units, infantry divisions, and scattered remnants from D-Day. He had no illusions about holding the peninsula permanently. American material superiority was overwhelming, but he had explicit orders from Berlin to delay the American advance as long as possible and destroy Cherbourg's port facilities completely before surrendering. Every day Cherbourg held out was another day the Allies couldn't use the port. Every day without the port meant Allied supplies arriving over beaches instead of through a functioning harbour. Farnbacher couldn't win, but he could deny the Americans victory. So he ordered a fighting withdrawal up the peninsula, making the Americans pay for every mile, buying time for demolition teams to wire Cherbourg's docks and cranes with explosives. The 4th, 9th and 79th Infantry Divisions cut across the Cotentin Peninsula in 3 days, a remarkable achievement that isolated German forces in the north. The attack began on June 14th with overwhelming artillery preparation followed by coordinated infantry armour assault. German defenders fell back in good order, but they fell back. By June 17th, American forces reached the west coast of the peninsula at Barneville, cutting off German retreat routes. 40,000 German troops were now trapped in the northern peninsula with their backs to the sea. In theory, this should have made their defeat inevitable and quick. In practice, they continued fighting with the desperation of men who knew surrender meant Soviet prison camps for those from the east or occupation duty for those from the west. The terrain favoured defence, the same hedgerows that plagued operations everywhere in Normandy, and Hitler's orders to fight to the last man meant no organised surrender until the last possible moment. The Great Storm hit on June 19th and changed everything about the Cherbourg operation. For 3 days, the worst Channel storm in 40 years pounded the Normandy coast. Wind speeds reached 60 miles per hour. Waves reached 12 feet. The American Mulberry A artificial harbour at Omaha Beach, an engineering marvel of floating breakwaters, piers and pontoons, was destroyed. 800 vessels were damaged or sunk. The storm caused more material losses than D-Day itself. When the storm passed on June 22nd, Allied logistics planners ran the numbers and reached a terrifying conclusion. Without Cherbourg operational immediately, the armies would run out of supplies within weeks. The drive for Cherbourg transformed from strategically important to desperately urgent. Collins received orders to take the city, regardless of cost. Speed mattered more than casualties. Time mattered more than tactics. The outer defences of Cherbourg were German field fortifications turned into permanent positions, pillboxes carved into hillsides, anti-tank ditches 30 feet wide, minefields mapped only in the minds of the engineers who laid them, who are now dead or evacuated, machine gun positions sighted to cover every approach, artillery pre-registered on every likely avenue of advance. The 4th Infantry Division hit these defences on June 22nd and made virtually no progress in the first day. Attacks that should have penetrated a mile gained 200 yards, casualties mounted. Artillery support helped but couldn't destroy bunkers built into solid rock. Air support couldn't see targets through smoke and dust. By nightfall, division commanders were reporting that frontal assault was proving too costly. They needed time to find gaps, to flank positions, to probe for weakness. Collins told them they didn't have time. Attack again tomorrow. Use more artillery. Accept the casualties. Cherbourg must fall quickly. Urban combat in Cherbourg began on June 25th and was as brutal as any fighting in the European theatre. German defenders turned the city into a fortress, with each building potentially hiding a machine gun position, each street covered by anti-tank guns, each intersection mined or wired with explosives. American infantry fought room to room, floor to floor, sometimes wall to wall, as engineers blew holes through buildings to avoid exposed streets. Tank infantry teams worked methodically through city blocks, tanks providing covering fire while infantry cleared buildings, infantry protecting tanks from Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets fired from windows and basements. Progress was measured in buildings per hour, not miles per day. Snipers killed men randomly. Booby traps killed more. The fighting lacked the dramatic sweeps of mobile warfare, but demanded constant alertness and courage. Every door could hide death. Every room required grenades before entry. The infantry who trained for offensive operations in open terrain found themselves fighting a medieval siege with modern weapons. General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben commanded Cherbourg's defense from an underground command post that American intelligence couldn't locate. He was a competent, professional officer following impossible orders defend to the last man while ensuring the port was destroyed. His garrison was down to 15,000 effectives by June 25th, outnumbered 4-1, with ammunition running low and no hope of resupply or reinforcement. He continued directing the defense because that was his duty and because Hitler's orders permitted no discretion. When American forces finally overran his command post on June 26th, they found elaborate plans for port demolition, comprehensive mine maps, and orders specifying that Cherbourg must remain useless to the Allies for months. Von Schlieben surrendered to Major General Manton Eddy of the 9th Infantry Division at 3 in the afternoon. He was professional and correct, neither apologizing nor boasting, simply informing the Americans that the port destruction was complete and Cherbourg would serve them no purpose. The port of Cherbourg was the most thoroughly demolished facility captured by American forces in the European War. German engineers had spent 3 weeks preparing demolitions with Prussian efficiency. Every crane was toppled into the harbour. Every basin was blocked with scuttled ships, 20 large vessels sunk in critical locations. Every pier was crated with explosives. Every warehouse was burned. The harbour entrance was mined with delayed action mines that would detonate randomly for months. Lock gates were destroyed. Power stations were demolished. Even the fuel storage tanks were drained and wrecked. American engineers who arrived to assess the damage found destruction on a scale they'd never imagined. Preliminary estimates suggested the port wouldn't be functional for 3 months. That estimate proved optimistic. The port didn't open to shipping until September 16th. 82 days after capture, Cherbourg had fallen, but it wouldn't help the armies fighting in Normandy for another 3 months. The cost-benefit analysis of the Cherbourg operation painted a grim picture. 7 Corps suffered 22,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, to capture a city and port that wouldn't be operational in time to support the Normandy campaign. The casualty ratio was nearly 4-1 against the attackers, meaning every German casualty cost 4 American casualties. The port that was supposed to solve Allied logistics problems sat useless while supplies continued coming over beaches. The operation succeeded in its narrow tactical goal. Cherbourg was captured, German forces in the Cotentin Peninsula were eliminated. But it failed in its strategic purpose. The Allies didn't gain the logistics advantage they desperately needed. The armies in Normandy would continue being supplied over beaches and through the British Mulberry Harbour at Arromanches. The American logistics crisis that the Cherbourg operation was supposed to solve continued unabated. And the question nobody wanted to ask was whether those 22,000 casualties had been worth it for a port that wouldn't help for 3 months. By the end of June, 850,000 Allied troops were in Normandy, but they were being supplied across beaches that were never designed for long-term logistics operations. The situation was sustainable but precarious. Ammunition shortages were developing, fuel reserves were tight, vehicle maintenance was suffering because spare parts arrived irregularly. The logistics officers who'd planned for Cherbourg to be operational by early July now scrambled to improvise solutions for problems that weren't supposed to exist. The Red Ball Express continuous truck convoys hadn't been planned but became necessary. Fuel pipelines under the channel were accelerated but couldn't be completed quickly. Artillery units received instructions to conserve ammunition. Offensive operations were being constrained not by German resistance but by supply limitations. The drive for Cherbourg had succeeded militarily and failed logistically. The city was captured. The port was useless. And the armies in Normandy faced a supply crisis that would constrain operations for months. Sometimes winning the battle doesn't win the campaign. Sometimes capturing the objective doesn't achieve the goal. Cherbourg was supposed to be the solution to Allied logistics problems. Instead, it became evidence that even successful operations can fail in their strategic purpose when the enemy is willing to destroy everything rather than let it be used against him. Sergeant Curtis Cullen welded 2 pieces of German beach obstacles to the front of a Sherman tank on a July afternoon and didn't realize he'd invented a solution to the problem that was killing the American advance. The hedgerows of Normandy looked innocent on maps, just property boundaries between fields, marked with dotted lines that seemed irrelevant to military operations. In reality, they were earthen walls 4 to 6 feet thick, topped with dense vegetation, their roots woven through 1,000 years of growth. Each hedgerow created a compartment 50 to 100 yards on a side. Each compartment was a separate battlefield invisible from the next. Tank crews couldn't see over hedgerows. When tanks tried to crash through, they tilted upward, exposing thin bottom armor to German Panzerfaust rockets. Infantry advancing alone was slaughtered by machine guns they couldn't locate. The bocage Norman farmland that farmers loved and soldiers called Green Hell was defeating American armoured superiority more effectively than German panzers ever had. Cullen's invention was crude, welded steel prongs that dug into hedgerow bases, allowing tanks to punch through without exposing their bellies. Within 2 weeks, 500 Sherman tanks were modified. The invention didn't come from engineers or armour officers. It came from a sergeant who was tired of watching friends die attacking hedgerows. The intelligence failure regarding Norman hedgerows was comprehensive and inexcusable. Allied planners studied aerial photographs, terrain maps, and French agriculture reports. They identified hedgerows and noted them on maps. What they failed to understand was that these weren't American-style fence lines. They were earthen fortifications built accidentally over centuries by farmers who'd never imagined their land would become a battlefield. Each hedgerow was 3 to 6 feet of packed earth and rock, reinforced by roots and crowned with thick bushes. Some hedgerows were 12 feet thick at the base. Tank crews discovered that ramming hedgerows bent steel and broke tracks. Artillery fire rarely destroyed them. Shells exploded in the vegetation without cratering the earth beneath. Bulldozers worked, but bulldozers were rare and vulnerable. The compartmentalized terrain turned every field into a separate battle where numerical superiority meant nothing because only a few soldiers could fight at once. American advantages in armour, artillery, and air power were neutralized by Norman agriculture. The 83rd Infantry Division attacked towards Saint-Lô in early July and learned the brutal mathematics of hedgerow warfare. The objective was 1,000 yards away, less than 2/3 of a mile. In open terrain, infantry could cover that distance in 10 minutes. In the bocage, it took 3 days and cost 1,400 casualties. Every hedgerow required the same tactical sequence. Suppress with artillery, advance infantry to the hedgerow, probe for German positions, locate machine guns by drawing fire. Men died during this step, call artillery or air support on German positions, assault through the hedgerow into the next field, clear the field, reorganize, repeat for the next hedgerow. The process took 2 to 4 hours per hedgerow when it went well, longer when German defenders were experienced or stubborn. Division commanders calculated that at this rate, reaching Germany would take years. The joke among infantry was that they'd reach Berlin just in time for social security benefits. The reality was worse than the joke suggested. German defenders adapted to hedgerow warfare faster than American attackers because they understood the defensive advantages immediately. A 3-man German team with 1 MG-42 machine gun could defend a field against a company. The tactic was simple and devastatingly effective. Position the machine gun to fire parallel to the hedgerow across the field, not toward the hedgerow where attackers would enter. When Americans emerged into the field, the machine gun fired a 5-second burst, 60 to 80 rounds, traversing across the field at ankle height. Then, the German team retreated through a hidden gap in the next hedgerow before American artillery could respond. By the time Americans cleared the field, the German team was positioned in the next field, waiting. 1 German machine gun team could delay an American company for hours and inflict significant casualties before being forced back. Multiply this tactic across thousands of hedgerows, and the result was an advance measured in yards per day at horrific cost. The 2nd Infantry Division's experience on July 10th illustrated the resource cost of hedgerow fighting. A tank infantry team was tasked with clearing a single hedgerow-enclosed field near Saint-Lô. The field was approximately 100 yards square, 1 acre. Intelligence suggested it was lightly held. The operation began at 9 in the morning, with artillery preparation, 30 minutes of fire from 12 howitzers. Infantry advanced and immediately took casualties from machine gun fire. The attack stalled. Air support was called 4 P-47 Thunderbolts, dropped bombs and strafed the field. Infantry advanced again and encountered more machine gun fire from positions that had survived the bombardment. Engineers moved forward to blow holes in the hedgerow with Bangalore torpedoes. German artillery hit the engineers, causing casualties. The infantry finally assaulted at 1 in the afternoon with tank support and grenades, clearing the field by hand-to-hand combat in some spots. The field was secured by 1:30. Cost: 4 hours of continuous combat, 12 Americans killed, 31 wounded, artillery support from 12 howitzers, air support from 4 fighter bombers, engineer support, tank support, all to capture 1 acre of French farmland, and there were thousands more fields ahead. The 30th Infantry Division's advance towards Saint-Lô became the bloodiest per-mile advance in the American Army's European experience. The division needed 6 days to advance 4,000 yards less than 2.5 miles. Casualties were 1,500 men, which meant 1 casualty for every 8 feet of ground gained. Companies that began operations with 180 men were down to 90. Some platoons were led by sergeants because all the officers were casualties. The division historian later calculated that at the rate of advance and casualties experienced in the Saint-Lô drive, the division would cease to exist as an effective fighting force before reaching the German border. The arithmetic was simple and horrifying. The division couldn't replace casualties fast enough to sustain the advance. Every attack consumed men faster than replacements arrived. And this wasn't unique to the 30th Division. Every American division fighting in the Bocage faced the same mathematics. The advance was succeeding, but it was consuming the army in the process. Cullen's hedgerow cutter changed the tactical dynamic by restoring tank mobility. Before the invention, tanks advancing on hedgerows had to stop, fire into the vegetation, hoping to suppress defenders, then attempt to crash through or find gaps. The process was slow and made tanks vulnerable. After modification with Cullen cutters, tanks could punch through hedgerows at speed, entering fields fast enough to suppress German defenders before they could fire Panzerfausts. Tank infantry teams could clear fields in 30 minutes instead of 3 hours. The invention spread through the American armor units like wildfire. Tankers fabricated cutters from German beach obstacles, destroyed tanks, anything steel. By late July, 500 Sherman tanks had been modified. The impact on operations was immediate divisions that had been advancing a mile per day were now advancing 3 to 4 miles per day. The hedgerow problem wasn't solved, but it was mitigated. American firepower and mobility advantages were partially restored. The Bocage was still deadly, but it was no longer insurmountable. The German defensive strategy in the Bocage was buying time, not winning victories. German divisions holding the hedgerows were down to 30 to 40% of authorized strength. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel was scarce. Reinforcements weren't arriving. But the terrain was so favorable to defense that understrength units could hold against overwhelming attacks. German commanders understood they couldn't stop the American advance permanently. The goal was to delay it long enough for political changes or miracle weapons to alter the strategic situation. Every week the Americans spent in the Bocage was a week Germany could use to prepare defences deeper in France, to produce more weapons, to hope for a political settlement. The hedgerow defence was a delaying action, fought with the desperation of an army that knew it was losing but refused to quit. And it was working. The Americans were advancing, but slowly, painfully, at enormous cost. The Bocage was doing what German panzers couldn't. It was bleeding the American Army white one field at a time. The psychological toll of hedgerow combat matched its physical costs. Infantry, who'd survived D-Day, and the initial battles reported that Bocage fighting was worse because it was unrelenting. Beach assaults were terrifying but brief. Hedgerow combat was terrifying and endless. Every field looked the same. Every hedgerow hid potential death. There was no front line, no safe rear area. German infiltrators operated behind American positions routinely. Soldiers developed hedgerow fatigue, a condition similar to shell shock, but specific to the claustrophobic, compartmentalized fighting. Men couldn't see the battlefield. They couldn't see their objective. They couldn't see progress. They simply moved from field to field, fighting and watching friends die for anonymous patches of French farmland that looked identical to the last patch they'd fought for yesterday and the patch they'd fight for tomorrow. Combat effectiveness declined not because soldiers were cowards, but because human beings can only sustain high-intensity combat for so long before breaking. The bocage was breaking men without killing them, creating casualties that didn't show up in the statistics but were just as real. By late July, the bocage campaign had created a crisis that American commanders were reluctant to acknowledge publicly. The advance was too slow, casualties were too high. Divisions needed rest and refit but couldn't be pulled from the line because there were no reserves. The replacement system couldn't keep up with losses. Ammunition consumption was exceeding production. The tactical situation was grinding toward attrition warfare reminiscent of World War I, the exact type of campaign that American doctrine insisted must be avoided. Bradley and Collins knew that breaking through the hedgerows required a different approach. Tactical adaptation like the Cullen Cutter helped, but wasn't enough. What they needed was operational breakthrough, a way to rupture the German line so completely that mobile warfare could resume. The solution would be Operation Cobra, a concentration of force unprecedented in the campaign. But before Cobra could be launched, the armies needed to accumulate ammunition, rest exhausted divisions, and prepare for an all-out assault. The bocage had taught the Americans that their advantages in firepower and mobility meant nothing if terrain prevented their use. The lesson was expensive, but it was learned. And the breakout, when it came, would apply every lesson purchased with blood in the Norman hedgerows. The sergeant responsible for ammunition distribution at 1st Army headquarters stared at requisition forms that didn't match the available supplies. It was July 2nd, 1944, and the numbers told a story that contradicted every optimistic briefing from logistics officers. Divisions at the front were requesting 150,000 rounds of 105mm howitzer ammunition per week. Actual deliveries were averaging 95,000 rounds, a 37% shortfall. Artillery battalions were being told to reduce their fire missions by 40%. Infantry company commanders were reporting that promised mortar ammunition hadn't arrived in 3 days. Tank units were cannibalizing destroyed vehicles for spare parts because new parts weren't arriving. And nobody above division level seemed to understand the problem because the official logistics reports showed everything on schedule. The difference between what the reports said and what was actually happening in Normandy was creating a crisis that could stop the advance more effectively than German resistance. You can't fight without ammunition. You can't maneuver without fuel. And you can't sustain armies when supply ships are still waiting offshore because there's no port to unload them. The Great Storm of June 19th through 22nd destroyed more than ships and artificial harbours. It destroyed the entire logistics timeline for the Normandy campaign. The American Mulberry Artificial Harbour at Omaha Beach was supposed to handle 7,000 tons of supplies daily, once fully operational. The storm reduced it to wreckage. British engineers estimated repairs would take 6 weeks, but realistically, the Mulberry was a total loss. This meant all American supplies had to come across open beaches or through the British Mulberry at Arromanches, which was already operating at capacity for British and Canadian forces. The logistics plan assumed 2 functioning Mulberries by July 1st. Instead, there was one, serving 3 armies. The mathematics was simple and devastating. Planned supply delivery was 16,000 tonnes daily. Actual delivery averaged 9,000 tonnes. The 7,000-tonne daily deficit compounded every day. By early July, the supply deficit reached the equivalent of 10 days of projected consumption. The armies in Normandy were running on borrowed time, consuming supplies faster than they could be replaced. The Red Ball Express began as an improvised emergency measure and became the lifeline that kept American armies moving. On July 2nd, Transportation Corps officers calculated that beaches couldn't deliver supplies fast enough even if weather was perfect. Cherbourg wouldn't be operational for months. Rail lines were destroyed. The only option was trucks, thousands of trucks, running continuous loops from Normandy beaches to forward depots near the front. The The Red Ball Express officially began on August 25th, but the system was operating informally in July. 6,000 trucks, driven primarily by black soldiers in segregated units, operated 24 hours a day. Drivers slept in their cabs during loading and unloading. The trucks ran in convoys on designated routes where all other traffic was prohibited. At peak operation, Red Ball Express was hauling 12,500 tons daily, equivalent to 125 loaded freight trains. Without it, the armies would have ground to a halt. Regardless of German resistance, the express crews knew this. They pushed their vehicles past sustainable limits, burning out engines, driving on bad tyres, skipping maintenance because stopping meant supplies didn't reach the front. The petroleum crisis nearly stopped offensive operations in late July before Operation Cobra could launch. American armies were consuming 800,000 gallons of fuel daily, twice the planned rate. The increase came from longer supply lines, more vehicles than anticipated, and constant movement as divisions manoeuvred through bocage. The fuel came from England via ships that had to anchor offshore and pump fuel into smaller craft for beach delivery. The system was slow, weather-dependent, and inadequate. Operation Pluto Pipeline Under the Ocean was supposed to solve the fuel crisis by running pipelines under the channel from England to France. Engineers completed the first pipeline in July, but its capacity was 60,000 gallons, daily 8% of requirements. By July 20th, 8 Corps received orders to halt offensive operations not because of German resistance but because fuel stocks were exhausted. Artillery batteries had ammunition but couldn't fire support missions because their trucks had no fuel to bring forward the shells. Tank companies sat idle because there was no diesel. The invisible crisis of supply logistics was threatening to do what German counterattacks couldn't stop the American advance completely. Ammunition shortages created operational constraints that affected how battles were fought. American doctrine relied on overwhelming firepower when encountering resistance. The standard procedure was to withdraw, call artillery, and blast the position before assaulting again. This doctrine worked when ammunition was plentiful. In July, it became unsustainable. Artillery battalions received ammunition quotas. Batteries were limited to specific numbers of rounds per mission. Forward, observers were told to prioritize targets and clear fire missions through battalion before engaging. Company commanders learned to attack without preparatory fires to conserve ammunition. The shift from firepower-intensive tactics to ammunition-conserving tactics increased infantry casualties because soldiers were attacking positions that would have been suppressed by artillery in normal circumstances. The irony was, bitter American soldiers died because American logistics couldn't deliver enough ammunition to execute American doctrine. The richest, most industrialized nation in history was rationing ammunition to its armies in combat. The ordnance crisis extended beyond ammunition to every type of supply. Tank battalions were cannibalizing destroyed Shermans for parts because new tanks arrived without spare parts, without tools, sometimes without basic maintenance equipment. Boots wore out faster in Normandy mud than in training. Uniform replacements weren't arriving fast enough. Medical supplies were adequate for immediate casualty treatment but insufficient for longer-term care. Hospitals in England were receiving wounded faster than supply ships could deliver plasma, sulfur drugs, and surgical supplies. Food was usually adequate but monotonous, the same rations day after day, because variety required supply space that was needed for ammunition and fuel. Small unit morale suffered not from lack of essentials, but from the constant shortage of everything. Soldiers learned that nothing worked as planned, that every supply requisition was delayed or partially filled, that improvisation was the only way to keep functioning. The logistics crisis was invisible to people reading newspapers in America, but viscerally real to soldiers living it in France. The replacement system collapsed under the weight of hedgerow casualties. American doctrine assumed that divisions could sustain operations indefinitely if individual replacements filled casualty vacancies. The theory worked on paper. In practice, the bocage was consuming men faster than the replacement pipeline could deliver them. Companies were supposed to have 180 men. By late July, many were operating with 90 to 120 platoons were led by sergeants because there weren't enough lieutenant replacements. Squad leaders were privates because there weren't enough sergeant replacements. The replacements who did arrive were undertrained. Many had been in the army less than 6 months and in infantry training less than 3 months. They didn't know their equipment, didn't know their squad mates, and died at disproportionate rates because they lacked the survival instincts that experienced soldiers developed. Veteran infantry called replacements green or fresh meat with callous accuracy replacement casualty rates in their first week of combat were triple the rate for experienced soldiers. The replacement system was supposed to sustain combat power indefinitely. Instead, it was gradually transforming veteran divisions into collections of partially trained survivors and inexperienced replacements. The supply crisis was worst in categories that didn't make headlines. Radios failed from moisture and rough handling faster than replacements arrived. Engineers needed specialised equipment that wasn't in the supply system. Military police needed traffic control equipment that didn't exist in theatre. Graves registration units needed body bags and caskets that were in short supply. The Quartermaster Corps needed warehouse space that didn't exist because Cherbourg was demolished. Transportation Corps needed fuel for trucks, hauling fuel for combat units, a recursive problem that consumed supplies, delivering supplies. Every army unit had specialised needs that the supply system couldn't meet because the system was designed for operations assuming functioning ports, railroads, and rear areas. Normandy had none of these. Everything came across beaches or through one British port. The improvisation required to make the system function at all was remarkable. That it functioned inadequately was inevitable. And that it constrained operations was the invisible reality of the Normandy campaign. By late July, the supply situation reached a crisis point that forced operational decisions. Bradley had to choose between continuing pressure across the entire front or concentrating resources for a breakthrough attempt. Continuing broad pressure meant every division remained undersupplied. Concentrating resources meant some divisions would halt operations while others got priority supply. Bradley chose concentration. Operation Cobra would receive priority for ammunition, fuel, and air support. Other sectors would go on the defensive temporarily. The decision was correct, but revealed the constraint that supply logistics placed on operations. The richest nation in the world couldn't supply its armies adequately 6 weeks into the campaign. The problem wasn't production. American factories were producing more supplies than ever. The problem was delivery. Without functioning ports, everything depended on beaches, trucks, and improvisation. The supply crisis wouldn't be solved until September, when Antwerp's port opened. Until then, every operation was constrained by logistics. Every advance had to be calculated not just against German resistance, but against fuel and ammunition stocks. And every commander planning operations had to remember that moving faster than the supply system could support meant grinding to a halt from logistical exhaustion rather than enemy action. The invisible supply crisis of July 1944 taught the American Army a lesson that it kept relearning throughout history. Logistics determines what's possible operationally. Brilliant tactics are useless without ammunition. Mobile warfare requires fuel. Sustained combat requires replacement of losses. None of these are glamorous. None make good headlines. But all are absolutely essential. The soldiers fighting in hedgerows understood this intimately. They knew that every artillery mission was rationed. They knew that advancing too far meant outrunning supply trucks. They knew that attacking without ammunition reserves was suicide. The supply crisis didn't stop the Normandy campaign, but it shaped how the campaign was fought. It forced concentration of resources for breakthrough operations. It required defensive periods to build up supplies. It meant that some operationally sound plans couldn't be executed because there wasn't enough fuel or ammunition to support them. The crisis was invisible to most people watching the war, but it was the foundation constraint that determined what was possible in France in the summer of 1944. Armies march on their stomachs, according to Napoleon, but they also march on ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and 1,000 other supplies that nobody thinks about until they're not there. And in Normandy in July, they increasingly weren't there. The question was whether the armies could break out before the supply crisis forced them to halt, whether they wanted to or not. The bombardier couldn't see the ground through the clouds, which meant he was dropping his bombs based on timing and instruments rather than visual confirmation of the target. It was 7 in the morning on July 24th, 1944, and 350 B-24 Liberators were attempting to carpet bomb German positions south of St. Lo to open Operation Cobra. The plan called for bombing perpendicular to the American front lines to minimize the risk of hitting friendly forces. At the last minute, air commanders changed the flight path to parallel the front lines because it was operationally simpler for the bomber formations. Nobody told the ground commanders about the change. The bombardiers had orders to add a safety delay of several seconds to their bomb release to ensure they didn't hit American troops. In heavy clouds with poor visibility, those safety delays were estimates. The bombs began falling at 7:05. By 7:15, reports reached headquarters that American positions were being hit. 25 soldiers were dead. 131 were wounded. And Operation Cobra, the breakthrough operation that was supposed to end the Bocage stalemate, was being postponed because the Air Force had just bombed its own army. The decision to try again the next day was controversial and courageous in equal measure. General Omar Bradley argued for postponement until weather cleared completely. Air Force commanders insisted they could execute the mission accurately in marginal conditions. Eisenhower authorized the operation for July 25th despite the previous day's disaster. The scale of the bombing was unprecedented. In support of ground operations, 1800 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers, followed by fighter bombers, followed by medium bombers, dropping 4,700 tons of explosives on a rectangular target area, 7,000 yards wide by 2,500 yards deep. For comparison, the Hiroshima atomic bomb would release explosive force equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The Cobra bombardment was using conventional explosives to deliver nearly 1/3 of an atomic bomb's destructive power in a single morning. If it worked, the bombing would obliterate German defences and open a breakthrough corridor. If it failed, it would waste resources needed elsewhere and probably kill more Americans in the process. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair insisted on observing the bombardment from a frontline position despite being the highest-ranking American officer in Europe. At 61 years old, McNair commanded Army ground forces and was responsible for training every American soldier who deployed overseas. He was visiting the front to observe Cobra's execution and provide lessons learned for future operations. His staff positioned him in a forward observation post with supposedly clear view of the target area. At 11:38 on July 25th, B-24 bombers began their runs. At 11:40, bombs began falling short again. The same problem as the previous day, poor visibility, parallel approach to front lines, safety delays that were guesswork in cloudy conditions. McNair's foxhole took a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb. His body was identified by the 3 stars on his collar and his West Point ring. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre. 111 other American soldiers died in the friendly fire. 621 were wounded. 2 entire companies were rendered combat ineffective by their own air force, and the operation continued anyway because stopping again would waste the entire effort. Panzer Division ceased to exist as a coherent military formation in the first hour of the bombardment. The division held the target area with approximately 2,200 effective combat troops, all that remained of its original strength of 14,800 men. The survivors were dug into foxholes, trenches, and reinforced positions that had survived 6 weeks of combat. None of it mattered against carpet bombing. The bombs fell in continuous waves for over an hour. The ground became a moonscape of overlapping craters. Bunkers collapsed, trenches caved in, men were killed by concussion even when bombs didn't strike them directly. The few survivors emerged from the bombardment shell-shocked, bleeding from ears and noses, unable to hear or speak coherently. The division commander, Fritz Bayerlein, survived in his command post and later described the bombardment as like being at the center of an earthquake. When American ground forces attacked at 2 in the afternoon, they encountered virtually no organized resistance in the bombardment area. Panzer had held this sector for 6 weeks against repeated American attacks. The carpet bombing destroyed it in 90 minutes. The 2nd Armoured Division exploitation following the bombardment revealed both the success and the limits of Operation Cobra. Lead elements advanced 5 miles on July 25th, 12 times the daily average for July. German positions that would have required days of hedgerow fighting were overrun in hours. Resistance was scattered and disorganized. By July 26th, the division had penetrated 15 miles behind German lines, creating a gap in German defences that couldn't be closed with available reserves. The breakthrough had succeeded, but the cost-benefit analysis was troubling. Every mile gained in Cobra cost approximately 300 American casualties, 1/5 the cost per mile of hedgerow fighting in early July. The improvement was dramatic, but the absolute numbers were still horrific. 3,500 American casualties to advance 12 miles meant that reaching Germany at this rate would require 250,000 casualties. The breakthrough had succeeded, but it had succeeded through overwhelming violence that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. You can't carpet bomb every German position between Normandy and Berlin. General George Patton's Third Army was officially activated on July 28th with orders to exploit the Cobra breakthrough. Patton was the most aggressive, controversial, and effective American field commander in Europe. He'd been sidelined after slapping soldiers in Sicily, used as bait for the Fortitude deception, and was now unleashed to do what he did best: attack. His orders from Bradley were clear pour through the breakthrough, drive into Brittany, capture the ports, then turn east toward the Seine. Patton looked at the orders and saw something else, an opportunity to conduct mobile warfare on a scale not seen since the German Blitzkrieg in 1940. His tanks could move faster than German reinforcements could respond. His troops could exploit chaos better than Germans could restore order. And he had no intention of letting caution or logistics or anything else slow him down. The Bocage breakthrough was opening. Patton intended to drive through it before it closed. The Seven Corps attack following the bombardment revealed a crucial tactical lesson. Breakthrough requires more than destroying enemy positions. It requires exploiting the destruction faster than the enemy can recover. The initial attack on July 25th made limited progress despite the devastating bombardment. Infantry advanced cautiously, expecting resistance that mostly didn't exist. Tank units followed doctrine designed for hedgerow fighting rather than exploitation. By the time American commanders realized how completely the bombardment had succeeded, precious hours were lost. German reserves were beginning to move toward the breach. The opportunity for rapid exploitation was narrowing. On July 26th, Bradley personally ordered commanders to accelerate the advance, to bypass resistance, to prioritize speed over security. The change in mindset was critical. Once units began moving aggressively, German defenses couldn't stabilize. The breakthrough became a breakout, and the breakout became the beginning of the end for German forces in Normandy. The friendly fire casualties from Operation Cobra haunted American commanders for the rest of the war. 136 American soldiers killed by American bombs, 621 wounded. The death of Lieutenant General McNair was particularly devastating. He was irreplaceable in his role, training American forces. The Air Force and Army conducted investigations, identified problems with communication and procedures, and implemented changes. But the fundamental problem was unsolvable. Carpet bombing near friendly forces in marginal weather with imperfect navigation was inherently dangerous. The safety measures, delays in bomb release, parallel flight paths, marking of friendly positions with coloured smoke, reduced risk but couldn't eliminate it. The decision facing commanders was whether the operational benefit of carpet bombing justified the risk of friendly casualties. In Operation Cobra, the answer was yes, the breakthrough succeeded, German defences were shattered, and the campaign was transformed. But the cost was American soldiers killed by American bombs, and there was no way to explain to their families that their deaths were necessary for military success. Friendly fire was and remains the most painful type of casualty because it's simultaneously avoidable and inevitable in modern combined arms warfare. The German response to the Cobra breakthrough was confused and inadequate because the German command structure in Normandy was collapsing. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge had replaced Rommel after Rommel was wounded in an air attack on July 17th. Von Kluge arrived with Hitler's orders to hold every metre of ground and launch immediate counterattacks to restore the line. But he had no reserves to counterattack with. The panzer divisions were shattered from 6 weeks of combat. Infantry divisions were at 30% strength. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel was scarce. And now American armour was pouring through a 15-mile gap that couldn't be closed. Von Kluge requested permission to conduct strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions. Hitler refused. The result was paralysis. German units received orders to hold positions they couldn't defend and to counterattack with forces that didn't exist. American spearheads drove through gaps in German lines, bypassing strongpoints, capturing headquarters, creating chaos. By July 28th, German commanders had lost control of the situation. The war of attrition in the Bocage was over. Mobile warfare had returned. And the Germans were on the wrong side of it. The immediate aftermath of Operation Cobra created a debate among American commanders that would continue for decades. Was carpet bombing the key to breakthrough, or could similar results have been achieved through other means? Advocates pointed to the rapid advance following the bombardment, 12 miles in 3 days compared to 1 mile in 6 days during typical Bocage fighting. Critics noted the friendly casualties, the resource cost, and the fact that German defences were already weakening from attrition. The truth was probably that carpet bombing was sufficient for breakthrough but not necessary. The German defences were crumbling anyway from 6 weeks of combat. Panzerlehr was already severely weakened. German logistics were failing, The Bocage advantage was being neutralized by tactical innovations like the Cullen hedgerow cutter. Operation Cobra accelerated a breakthrough that was probably inevitable within weeks. But acceleration mattered. Every week the breakthrough was delayed was another week of attrition warfare consuming irreplaceable infantry. From that perspective, the carpet bombing was justified despite its costs. It ended the Bocage stalemate decisively and immediately, and it did so at a moment when American logistics and personnel systems were straining under the weight of sustained combat. Cobra didn't just create a breakthrough, it ended a crisis. By August 1st, 6 days after Operation Cobra began, the American situation in Normandy was transformed. The Bocage deadlock was broken. Third Army was operational and attacking toward Brittany. German defences were in retreat or disarray. The question was no longer whether the Allies could break out of Normandy, but how far and how fast they could exploit the breakthrough. The cost of achieving this transformation was substantial: 5,000 casualties in Cobra itself, 35,000 in the broader Bocage campaign during July. But the alternative cost continuing, hedgerow warfare for another month, would have been worse. Operation Cobra was brutal, expensive, and successful. It killed Americans and Germans indiscriminately. It destroyed Norman towns and countryside. It demonstrated that breakthrough in World War II required overwhelming violence applied with precision against prepared defences. There was no elegant solution, no clever tactical manoeuvre that could avoid the bloodletting. There was only the willingness to accept catastrophic casualties in concentrated form rather than spreading them across weeks of attrition. Operation Cobra was the moment when the Normandy campaign shifted from whether the Allies would succeed to how quickly they would exploit success. The breakthrough was purchased with blood and high explosives in quantities that remain shocking even 80 years later. But it was purchased, and the German army in France would never recover from what came next. The reconnaissance unit from Third Army reached the outskirts of Avranches on July 31st and radioed back a message that changed the campaign. Town lightly defended, bridge intact. Recommend immediate exploitation. General George Patton received the message at his command post and made a decision that violated every doctrine about maintaining supply lines and consolidating positions. He ordered the entire 4th Armoured Division, 10,000 men and 200 tanks to drive through Avranches immediately and continue south into Brittany without waiting for flanks to be secured or supplies to be stockpiled. It was tactically risky and operationally brilliant. The gap at Avranches was the only corridor out of the Normandy Bocage. If Germans counterattacked and closed it, Third Army would be trapped. But Patton understood something his more cautious colleagues didn't speed, was its own form of security. Move faster than the enemy can react, and the enemy can't hurt you. By August 1st, 3 divisions were pouring through Avranches in a column that stretched back 20 miles. Patton stood at a crossroads, personally directing traffic like a policeman, shouting at drivers to keep moving, to ignore gaps in the column, to push south as fast as their vehicles could travel. He was 58 years old and orchestrating the largest American exploitation since the Civil War. The operational plan for Third Army's breakout made perfect sense on paper and required violating it in practice. Bradley's orders called for Third Army to drive into Brittany, capture the ports of Brest and St. Malo, then turn east to support First Army's advance toward Paris. The ports were supposed to solve the logistics crisis that had constrained operations since D-Day. Patton looked at the orders and saw a different opportunity. Brittany was a peninsula pointing west, away from Germany. The ports were undoubtedly demolished, like Cherbourg. The real opportunity was to the east: open terrain, demoralised German forces, and a clear path toward the Seine River. Patton gave orders that appeared to follow Bradley's plan while actually emphasising eastward exploitation. Divisions drove through Brittany fast enough to satisfy headquarters, but without committing to sieges of fortified ports. The primary thrust aimed east, deeper into France, cutting German supply lines and threatening encirclement of German forces still fighting at Normandy. It was insubordination disguised as aggressive execution of orders, and it was winning the campaign. The 4th Armoured Division advanced 40 miles on July 31st, a distance that would have taken 6 weeks in the Bocage. The division's Combat Command B drove through villages where German garrisons surrendered without fighting, past supply dumps that Germans abandoned without destroying, across bridges that Germans failed to demolish because they couldn't believe American armour could arrive so quickly. The division's history described the advance as like racing through an enemy already defeated. We encountered resistance occasionally, but not organized defense. The speed created its own problems. Units outran their maps. Supply trucks couldn't keep up. Communications broke down because radio range was exceeded. At one point, the division headquarters lost contact with its lead combat command for 6 hours because they'd advanced beyond the range of available radios. But the speed also prevented German counterattacks from forming. Every village the Americans captured was a village Germans couldn't use to organize defense. Every bridge captured intact was a bridge that couldn't delay the advance. Speed substituted for strength, momentum substituted for security. The 6th Armoured Division reached Brest on August 3rd and found the same situation that had stymied Cherbourg, a fortified city defended by determined troops with orders to destroy everything before surrendering. Brest was one of the primary objectives of the Brittany campaign. The port could theoretically handle 15,000 tons of supplies daily once operational, but capturing it would require siege warfare. The German garrison was 25,000 troops commanded by officers who'd seen what happened to commanders who surrendered without Hitler's permission. The 6th Armoured Division probed the defences, determined that assault would be costly, and settled in for siege. The siege would last 6 weeks and cost 10,000 American casualties. When Brest finally fell on September 19th, the port facilities were demolished so thoroughly that they never became operational during the war. The entire Brittany campaign accomplished nothing strategically useful. Every port was either demolished or too small to matter. But it tied down only minimal American forces while the main effort drove east. Patton's instinct to emphasize the eastern advance rather than the Brittany ports proved correct. The ports didn't matter. The pursuit into France did. The logistics impossibility of Third Army's advance became evident within days. The army was consuming fuel at 3 times the planned rate because it was moving 3 times faster than expected. Supply trucks couldn't keep pace with combat units. Fuel tankers delivered their loads and had to return to depots hundreds of miles away for refills. The Red Ball Express was operating at maximum capacity but couldn't deliver enough to support the advance. By August 7th, lead elements of Third Army were operating 100 miles beyond their supply lines with fuel for 1 more day of operations. Conventional military wisdom said the advance should halt, consolidate, and wait for logistics to catch up. Patton said the advance should continue and logistics would improvise. His units began siphoning fuel from destroyed German vehicles. They captured German fuel dumps and used captured gasoline in American vehicles. They prioritized fuel for combat units and left support units to walk. It was operationally insane and tactically brilliant. The advance continued because Patton refused to let logistics determine operations. Later analysis proved him right every day. Third Army was halted, was another day. German forces could escape. The logistics system caught up eventually. But if Patton had waited for it, the opportunity for exploitation would have passed. The advance toward Nantes revealed the changing character of warfare in France. Combat Command B of the 6th Armoured Division covered 120 miles in 8 days, August 3rd through August 10th. The same distance in Bocage country took 7 weeks. The open terrain of central France favoured mobility. German defenders were scattered and demoralised. Many units surrendered without fighting. Some German columns were overrun while retreating. Their trucks captured intact with supplies Americans desperately needed. The division captured 3,000 prisoners in 8 days of operations. Casualties were light fewer than 200 Americans killed or wounded, while advancing farther than the entire Normandy campaign had gained in 6 weeks. The transformation from bocage warfare to mobile exploitation was complete. American advantages in armour, artillery, and air power were finally being applied in terrain that didn't neutralise them. The result was warfare at a pace that resembled German blitzkrieg in 1940, except the Germans were the victims this time. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army began a chaotic retreat toward the Seine River in early August, trying to escape encirclement but lacking the fuel and transport to conduct organised withdrawal. Entire divisions disintegrated into company and battalion-sized groups walking east, abandoning heavy equipment, living off captured supplies or foraging from French farms. American reconnaissance units reported roads clogged with retreating Germans, not fighting formations but broken units trying to escape. Some German units maintained discipline and fought effective rearguard actions. Others surrendered to the first Americans they encountered. The Wehrmacht was experiencing the same collapse it had inflicted on France in 1940 and Russia in 1941. The difference was that German forces couldn't retreat to secure borders and rebuild. Every mile of retreat brought them closer to Germany and farther from supplies and reinforcements. The pursuit warfare that Patton excelled at was destroying German formations without the massive battles that characterized bocage fighting. Sometimes the best way to defeat an army is to make it run faster than it can move in good order. By August 12th, reconnaissance elements of 3rd Army were approaching the Seine River, 160 miles from their start line at Avranches. Paris was 30 miles north. Germany was 200 miles east. The campaign that was supposed to conclude with capture of Brittany ports had instead transformed into a race across France. Bradley and Eisenhower faced a decision that would shape the rest of the campaign: continue the pursuit toward Germany or pause to consolidate the lodgement and solve logistics problems. Patton advocated continuation, keep attacking while Germans are defeated, cross the Seine, drive to the Rhine, end the war by Christmas. Montgomery and more cautious commanders advocated consolidation, secure the flanks, bring up supplies, prepare for sustained advance. The decision would ultimately favour caution, a choice that historians still debate. Would continuing the pursuit have shortened the war? Or would it have created an unsustainable salient that Germans could counterattack? The question remains unanswerable. What's certain is that Third Army's breakout from Normandy and pursuit across France demonstrated that American forces could conduct mobile warfare as effectively as any army in history when given the terrain and opportunity to do so. The cost of the breakout was remarkably low compared to bocage warfare, approximately 4,000 Third Army casualties in 2 weeks of operations that gained 400 miles. The casualty rate per mile was 1/10 what it had been in the hedgerows. The low casualties reflected the changing nature of operations. In the bocage, every field was defended. In pursuit warfare, defenders were scattered and often willing to surrender. The psychological impact of the breakout on German morale was devastating. Soldiers who'd fought effectively in defensive positions abandoned those positions rather than be encircled. Units that had held for weeks in Normandy disintegrated in days during the retreat. The German army in France was suffering a moral collapse that no amount of tactical skill could prevent. They knew they were losing. They knew retreat led nowhere except toward Germany and eventual defeat. And they knew that American mobility and firepower could destroy them wherever they tried to make a stand. The breakout accomplished what the bocage fighting couldn't. It broke the German will to resist. And once that will broke, the material advantages that the Allies held became decisive. The criticism of Patton's breakout centered on logistics rather than tactics. Third Army advanced so far, so fast, that it created supply problems for the entire Allied command. Fuel that was supposed to support multiple armies was consumed by Patton's exploitation. Ammunition stocks were drawn down. Transport capacity was monopolized. Other armies had to slow their operations because Third Army was consuming resources faster than the logistics system could deliver them. The critics had valid points. Patton's advance wasn't sustainable, did create problems for adjacent forces, and possibly delayed other operations. But the strategic outcome suggests Patton was correct. His advance destroyed German forces in France, captured territory that would otherwise have required weeks of fighting, and created opportunities for encirclement that would trap entire German armies. The logistics problems were real but solvable. The opportunity to destroy German forces was temporary and irreplaceable. Patton understood that wars are won by taking risks when the enemy is vulnerable. The breakout from Normandy was that moment. And racing Patton across France, however problematic logistically, achieved strategic victory faster than cautious advance could have. Sometimes the aggressive option that looks reckless is actually the least costly way to win. The breakout proved it by destroying more German forces in 2 weeks than 2 months of bocage fighting had eliminated. The artillery preparation for the assault on Saint-Lô began at dawn on July 11th, with a sound that soldiers described as continuous thunder. 140 howitzers firing simultaneously create a noise that isn't heard so much as felt, a physical pressure that makes the ground vibrate and the air seem thick. The 29th Infantry Division was attacking a city they'd been fighting toward for 5 weeks, and everyone from the division commander to the newest private knew this would be the bloodiest battle of the Normandy campaign. Saint-Lô sat on high ground, dominating the surrounding terrain. Whoever controlled it controlled the road network toward the interior of France. The Germans knew this. They'd positioned the 3rd Parachute Division elite troops with extensive combat experience to defend it. The Americans needed Saint-Lô for Operation Cobra to succeed. There was no way around the city, no clever maneuver to avoid it. The 29th and 35th Divisions would attack frontally against prepared defences held by veteran troops, and the only question was how many Americans would die taking it. The artillery fell silent at 7 in the morning. The infantry climbed out of their positions and began walking toward a city that most of them wouldn't live to see. Captured. The German 352nd Infantry Division, defending the approaches to Saint-Lô, was the same unit that had slaughtered Company A of the 116th Regiment on Omaha Beach 6 weeks earlier. The symmetry wasn't lost on survivors of D-Day who were now attacking the same enemy in different terrain. The 352nd had fought continuously since June 6th, taking horrific casualties but maintaining defensive cohesion through professional leadership and veteran soldiers who knew their business. By early July, the division was down to 35% of its authorised strength. But those survivors were hard men who'd learned that retreating without orders meant execution by SS enforcers or military police. They defended every hedgerow, every village, every foot of ground, with the desperation of soldiers who knew retreat was more dangerous than fighting. The Americans had overwhelming numbers and firepower. The Germans had experience, determination, and terrain that favoured defence. The mathematical outcome was inevitable. The human cost would be catastrophic. Hill 122 dominated the southern approaches to Saint-Lô from a height of 400 feet, which doesn't sound impressive until you consider that Norman terrain is generally flat. The hill's designation came from its elevation in meters, 122 meters, 400 feet, high enough to observe everything for miles. German observers on Hill 122 could see American assembly areas, direct artillery onto American positions, and make advance impossible without taking the hill. The 115th Infantry Regiment received the mission on July 15th. The plan called for seizing the hill in 2 hours with 1 battalion. The attack began at 9 in the morning. By 3 in the afternoon, the hill was captured at cost of 500 casualties, 1 of every 4 attackers. The survivors held it through 3 German counterattacks that night. By dawn on July 16th, the regiment had lost 800 of 2,000 men holding a hill that measured 300 yards across at its summit. The hill had no name before the battle. After the battle, soldiers called it Purple Heart Hill because so many men were wounded or killed there. The official designation remained Hill 122, but everyone who fought there knew what it cost. The air bombardment of Saint-Lô on July 17th was supposed to support the ground assault by destroying German strongpoints. Instead, it demolished the city and killed French civilians while leaving German defenders largely intact. 350 medium bombers dropped 750 tons of explosives on a city that measured less than 1 square mile. The bombardment was accurate in hitting the target. Bombs fell exactly where aimed. But the target was a city, not specific military positions. The bombs destroyed buildings indiscriminately. Stone walls collapsed into streets. Rubble filled roads that infantry would need to advance down. The few surviving buildings were structurally unsound, liable to collapse from artillery impacts or even heavy footsteps. French civilians who'd survived 6 weeks of ground combat were killed in their basements by bombs from planes they couldn't hear coming. The final toll was over 300 French dead, more than half the pre-invasion population of the old city centre. And the German paratroopers defending Saint-Lô survived because they were dug into positions outside the city centre, not in the buildings that the bombs destroyed. The bombardment created rubble that slowed the American advance without significantly damaging German defences. Sometimes overwhelming firepower accomplishes nothing except destruction. The house-to-house fighting in Saint-Lô from July 18th through 19th was as brutal as any combat American troops experienced in the European theatre. Buildings that survived the bombardment became fortresses. German defenders occupied upper floors and basements, covering streets with machine gun fire, using Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets against Shermans that tried to support infantry. American infantry learned techniques that would become standard in urban warfare. Don't use doors or windows, use explosives to blow holes through walls, clear rooms with grenades before entering, assume every building is defended until proven otherwise. The 16th Infantry Regiment fought for 2 days to advance 3 city blocks, suffering 400 casualties in the process. Progress was measured in buildings, not blocks. Each building required the same process: suppress with machine gun fire, assault with grenades, clear room by room, move to next building while original building is secured by follow-up troops. It was methodical, exhausting, and deadly. Urban warfare favoured neither attacker nor defender. Particularly, it just killed whoever made mistakes or was unlucky. And in Saint-Lô, both sides made mistakes because urban combat was new to most participants. Major Thomas Howe commanded the 3rd Battalion, 116th Infantry Regiment during the final assault into Saint-Lô on July 18th. His battalion had suffered heavy casualties approaching the city but remained combat effective. Howe personally led the battalion in the final attack toward the city centre, directing troops from exposed positions because communications were unreliable in urban terrain. At 3 in the afternoon, German artillery hit his position. Howe was killed instantly by shell fragments. His body was recovered by his troops, who refused to leave their commander in the street. When American forces secured the city centre at St. Jean Church later that day, Howe's men carried his body on the hood of a jeep and draped it with an American flag. The image became iconic, the Major of Saint-Lô, dead in victory, a symbol of the cost of capturing a city that was 95% destroyed by the time Americans occupied it. Howe was 34 years old, a pre-war National Guard officer who'd commanded his battalion since D-Day. His death symbolised the others 2,900 officers and men killed or wounded in the 29th Infantry Division's drive to Saint-Lô, a 40% casualty rate for 9 days of operations. The city was captured. The cost was a generation. The German 3rd Parachute Division's defence of Saint-Lô demonstrated that even in defeat, professional soldiers could exact enormous costs. The division entered the battle with 4,000 effective troops. By July 19th, fewer than 850 men remained combat capable. The division inflicted over 5,000 American casualties, roughly a 6-to-1 ratio, before withdrawing from the ruins. They didn't retreat because they were defeated. They retreated because Saint-Lô no longer existed as a defensible position. The rubble created by the American bombardment made continued defence impossible. There were no intact buildings to occupy, no streets to defend, nothing but ruins. The paratroopers withdrew in good order to prepared positions south of the city, ready to fight the next battle. They'd accomplish their mission, delay the American advance, inflict maximum casualties, buy time for German forces to prepare defences deeper in France. The cost was nearly destroying their division, but from the German perspective, it was worth it. Every day Saint-Lô held was another day that Operation Cobra was delayed, another day that German reinforcements could move into position. The defence of Saint-Lô was a losing battle fought to win time. And time was the most valuable commodity Germany had in summer 1944. The psychological impact of Saint-Lô on American infantry was profound and lasting. Veterans who fought in both the bocage and urban warfare universally described Saint-Lô as worse. In the hedgerows, there was at least vegetation, natural cover, a sense of being outdoors. In Saint-Lô, there was only rubble, collapsed buildings, streets turned into canyons where every window and doorway could hide a machine gun. The fighting was claustrophobic. The casualties were constant. There was no sense of progress, because ruins all looked the same. Men fought for days to capture buildings that looked identical to buildings they'd captured the day before. The city became known as the capital of ruins, a title that captured both its destruction and its strategic importance. French filmmaker Samuel Fuller, who served as an infantryman in the 16th Regiment during the battle, later described Saint-Lô as the worst fighting he saw in the entire war, worse than D-Day, worse than the Hürtgen Forest, worse than anything. The statement from a man who survived the entire European campaign speaks to the unique horror of urban warfare against determined defenders. The liberation of Saint-Lô occurred on July 19th to a city that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. 95% of buildings were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The civilian population had fled or died. The infrastructure was obliterated. The roads were impassable without engineer work to clear rubble. From a military perspective, capturing Saint-Lô opened the way for Operation Cobra. From a humanitarian perspective, it represented the complete destruction of a Norman city that had existed since the 10th century. The French government later awarded Saint-Lô the Legion of Honour for the suffering its civilians endured. But the medal couldn't rebuild destroyed homes or resurrect dead civilians. The liberation came at a cost that the liberated couldn't afford and the liberators couldn't avoid. War destroys not just armies, but the places armies fight over. Saint-Lô was proof. By the time Americans raised the flag over its ruins, there was almost nothing left worth capturing except the symbolism and the strategic location. Sometimes military necessity requires destroying what you're trying to liberate. Saint-Lô was an extreme example of that tragic paradox. The strategic assessment of Saint-Lô's capture was that it was essential for operational success, but achieved at nearly unsustainable cost. The 29th and 35th Divisions suffered combined casualties approaching 5,000 men, roughly 40% of their infantry strength, in 9 days. Those divisions would need weeks to absorb replacements and recover combat effectiveness. But Operation Cobra couldn't wait. The divisions that captured Saint-Lô would be expected to attack again within a week, under strength and exhausted. This was the reality of continuous operations. There was no time for rest, no opportunity to rebuild, only the immediate tactical requirement to attack again. The casualties at Saint-Lô were mourned but not analysed deeply until after the war. Only then did military historians calculate that the casualty rate per mile of advance in the Saint-Lô operation was the highest in the entire European campaign. The rate was unsustainable for any extended period. Armies can't function indefinitely with 40% casualties every 10 days. But in the specific circumstance of July 1944, the casualties were accepted because there was no alternative. Saint-Lô had to be captured for Cobra to succeed. The infantry captured it. The cost was horrifying. But the mission was accomplished, and in the cold mathematics of military operations, mission accomplishment was what mattered. The dead and wounded would be mourned later. In the moment, they were casualties necessary for victory. War reduces human lives to tactical calculations. Saint-Lô was a particularly stark example. The German attack came out of the pre-dawn darkness at 2 in the morning on August 7th, with the distinctive sound of Panther tank engines and voices shouting in German. The 30th Infantry Division positions around Mortain had been overrun before most American soldiers realized they were under attack. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Intelligence had reported German forces withdrawing, falling back toward the Seine to avoid encirclement. Instead, 250 German tanks from 4 panzer divisions were attacking west toward Avranches, attempting to cut the American supply line and trap Third Army. The 2nd SS Panzer Division hit Mortain with overwhelming local superiority. They had armour, the Americans didn't. By 4 in the morning, German forces had penetrated 5 miles and were approaching Avranches. If they reached the town and held it for even 24 hours, they would cut off Patton's entire army. Third Army would be trapped with no supplies, no fuel, and no ammunition. The breakthrough that had seemed to win the campaign would become a disaster, and 700 American soldiers from the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry were surrounded on Hill 314 overlooking Mortain with orders to hold at all costs. They had no food, limited ammunition, and no way to evacuate wounded. The German attack was Hitler's last gamble to prevent the loss of France, and for 6 days, the outcome was uncertain. Adolf Hitler personally ordered the Mortain counterattack over the objections of every senior commander in France. Field Marshal von Kluge argued that the attack was operationally insane. German forces should withdraw toward the Seine, establish a defensible line, and preserve combat power for defending France's interior. Hitler refused. His order was explicit: attack through Mortain, 2 Avranches, cut American supply lines, defeat Third Army while it's isolated, throw the Allies back. Von Kluge received the order on August 5th with instructions that it was not subject to discussion or modification. He was to attack with all available armour on August 7th, regardless of tactical situation or intelligence reports. The order reflected Hitler's complete disconnect from military reality. He believed that willpower could overcome material disadvantage, that determined attacks could succeed regardless of Allied air superiority, that cutting American supply lines would cause collapse. Every assumption was wrong. But the Wehrmacht would execute the order anyway, because refusing meant arrest or execution for defeatism. The attack would fail. But Hitler's insistence on attacking rather than withdrawing would trap German armies in a position where they could be encircled and destroyed. Sometimes the enemy's worst decisions are your best opportunities. The 2nd SS Panzer Division's initial attack achieved tactical surprise because American intelligence had fundamentally misread German intentions. Ultra-intelligence decrypted German communications showed that Hitler had ordered counterattack, but Allied intelligence officers assessed the order as unrealistic and assumed German commanders wouldn't execute it. They were wrong. The 2nd SS Panzer Division attacked exactly as ordered with 100 tanks and supporting infantry. The 30th Infantry Division, defending Mortain, was an infantry division without significant armour support. When German panzers hit them at night, the result was predictable. American positions were overrun, units scattered, command and control collapsed. By 4 in the morning, the situation looked catastrophic. German armour was advancing rapidly, American forces were retreating or surrounded, radio traffic was panicked and confused. At First Army Headquarters, staff officers discussed whether they were witnessing the beginning of a major defeat. The answer would depend on whether American air power could respond and whether surrounded American units could hold long enough for help to arrive. Hill 314 overlooked Mortain from 300 feet of elevation, and the 700 men from the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry became the most famous surrounded unit of the Normandy campaign. When the German attack isolated them at 4 in the morning on August 7th, their battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Curley, made a rapid assessment. The hill dominated the terrain. If Germans controlled it, they could observe American positions for miles and direct artillery. If Americans held it, they could direct artillery onto German positions and observe enemy movements. Curley ordered his battalion to dig in and hold. By dawn, German forces surrounded the hill and began attempting to dislodge the Americans with infantry attacks supported by artillery. The Americans had radios, but no secure communication. Germans could hear every transmission. They had limited ammunition, a few days' supply for sustained combat. They had no food except what men carried. They had medical supplies for immediate treatment, but no way to evacuate seriously wounded. And they were completely cut off, with no relief force in position to reach them. Curley radioed division that his battalion would hold. For 6 days, they did. The Lost Battalion, as journalists later named them, though they were never actually lost, survived through artillery support directed by forward observers on the hill who could see German positions clearly. The battalion's artillery forward observer, First Lieutenant Robert Weiss, established communication with divisional artillery and began directing fire missions on August 7th. From his position on Hill 314, Weiss could see German assembly areas, tank formations, and supply columns. He called fire missions continuously, adjusting shells onto targets with devastating accuracy. German forces attempted to assault the hill 16 times over 6 days. Every attack was broken up by American artillery, directed by Weiss and other observers on the hill. The Germans couldn't dislodge the Americans as long as artillery support continued, but they couldn't bypass the hill because observers would see any movement and direct fire onto them. The situation was stalemate. Germans couldn't eliminate the Lost Battalion, and the battalion couldn't break out. But the stalemate favoured the Americans because every day the battalion held was another day that German advance was delayed. Allied air power destroyed the Mortain counterattack on August 7th with an intensity that German forces had never experienced. The 19th Tactical Air Command launched over 2,400 sorties individual aircraft missions in a single day over Mortain and the surrounding area. Fighter bombers attacked German armour columns continuously from dawn until dusk. P-47 Thunderbolts carried rockets and bombs. P-38 Lightnings strafed with machine guns and cannons. RAF Typhoons fired armour-piercing rockets at German tanks. The scale of air attack was unprecedented in support of ground operations. German tank commanders reported that movement during daylight was suicidal. Vehicles that moved were destroyed within minutes. The panzer divisions that attacked at night were forced to hide during day, losing momentum and allowing American ground forces to regroup. By August 8th, the German advance had stalled, not because of ground resistance they'd pushed aside most American infantry, but because air power prevented further advance. 100 German tanks were destroyed on August 7th alone, most by aircraft. The Mortain counterattack demonstrated conclusively that German ground forces couldn't operate effectively under Allied air supremacy. The relief of the Lost Battalion on Hill 314 happened on August 12th, when elements of the 35th Infantry Division broke through German positions and reached the hill. Of the original 700 men, 316 were still capable of combat. The rest were dead, wounded, or exhausted to fight. The survivors had been resupplied by parachute drops, small packages of ammunition, medical supplies, and food dropped from C-47 transports flying low over the hill while German anti-aircraft guns fired at them. Many supply bundles landed in German positions. Some landed on the hill but couldn't be recovered because German fire prevented movement. The men on the hill rationed ammunition to 5 rounds per rifle. They treated wounded with improvised medical care. They survived on 1 meal per day from parachute drops. And they held their position because they understood that if they abandoned the hill, Germans would control the key terrain. When relief forces finally reached them, the survivors were described as walking skeletons, filthy, exhausted, many wounded, all hungry. But they'd held. The Hill 314 defense didn't stop the Mortain counterattack, air power did that, but it became symbolic of American determination to hold ground at all costs. The strategic failure of the Mortain counterattack had consequences far beyond the tactical defeat. By attacking toward Avranches, German forces moved west when they should have retreated east. The attack concentrated German armour in exactly the wrong place forward, in a salient that could be cut off rather than withdrawing to defensible positions near the Seine. Hitler's insistence on counterattacking created the conditions for German disaster at Falaise. If German forces had withdrawn when von Kluge recommended, they might have escaped to fight another day. Instead, they attacked, failed, and remained in forward positions where they could be encircled. The Mortain counterattack was Hitler's last operational decision in France. It was also his worst. The attack destroyed German mobile reserves without achieving any strategic objective. It positioned German armies for encirclement, and it demonstrated that Hitler's interference in tactical operations was actively helping the Allies by forcing Germany to make catastrophically wrong decisions. Sometimes the greatest gift your enemy gives you is insisting on plans that guarantee his defeat. By August 13th, 6 days after it began, the Mortain counterattack was decisively defeated. German forces withdrew to avoid encirclement, leaving behind destroyed armour, abandoned equipment, and the strategic initiative. American casualties in the Mortain battle were approximately 1,500 killed and wounded. German casualties were over 5,000 plus 100 tanks destroyed, irreplaceable losses of men and equipment. But the strategic impact far exceeded the tactical results. The counterattack delayed German withdrawal, concentrated German forces where they were vulnerable, and created the opportunity for the Falaise encirclement that would destroy the German army in France. Hitler ordered Mortain to prevent catastrophe. Instead, the order created conditions for catastrophe on a scale that would end German resistance in France permanently. The Lost Battalion on Hill 314 held for 6 days and became famous for their courage. But the real story of Mortain was that Hitler's operational incompetence was helping the Allies win faster than Allied planning could have achieved alone. The counterattack was Germany's last offensive in France. After Mortain, it was all retreat, encirclement, and surrender. The question was how many Germans would be destroyed before they reached Germany, and how many would escape to fight another day. The aerial reconnaissance photograph taken on August 13th showed something that intelligence analysts had never seen before: an entire German army trapped in the open with nowhere to go. Major John Colgan flew his P-38 Lightning over the Falaise area at 8,000 feet, and what he saw made him break radio silence, despite strict orders against unnecessary transmission. "There are thousands of vehicles down there," he radioed to his controller. "Tanks, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, everything. They're not moving. They're just sitting there in columns, stretching for miles." What Colgan was photographing was the German 7th Army and remnants of 5th Panzer Army, approximately 100,000 troops trapped in a pocket 15 miles wide between American forces advancing from the south and British Canadian forces advancing from the north. The gap between Allied forces was narrowing to less than 20 miles. If it closed completely, the German armies would be encircled with no escape route. The photograph showed trucks abandoned on roads, artillery pieces unhitched and left where they stood, columns of troops on foot walking east trying to reach the gap before it closed. It was August 13th, 1944, and the largest encirclement battle in the Western European campaign was about to begin. The Falaise pocket formed because Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal until it was too late. Throughout late July and early August, German commanders from von Kluge downward requested permission to withdraw to the Seine River before American and British forces could complete encirclement. Hitler refused every request. His orders were explicit: hold current positions, counterattack at Mortain, do not retreat. By August 10th, 3 days after the Mortain counterattack failed, the strategic situation was catastrophic. American forces had turned north from their Brittany operations and were driving toward Argentan. British and Canadian forces were pushing south toward Falaise. The gap between them was 25 miles and closing. Every German unit west of the gap was at risk of encirclement. On August 11th, von Kluge finally received permission to withdraw, but he'd lost 3 critical days. The retreat that should have begun on August 8th began on August 11th. Those 3 days would cost Germany an entire army group. The Polish 1st Armoured Division attacked toward Chambord from the north on August 16th with orders to close the Falaise gap completely. The Poles were fighting for more than strategic objectives. They were fighting to avenge their country's occupation and destruction. Many had escaped Poland in 1939 and fought continuously since then. Now they were attacking German forces that were trapped and retreating. The Polish division commander, General Stanislaw Maciek personally led the attack on Chambois, driving his command vehicle at the front of his armour. By August 18th, Polish forces reached Chambois and linked up with American forces from the 90th Infantry Division, advancing from the south. The gap was closed. Approximately 50,000 German troops were now completely encircled in the Falaise pocket with no escape route. Another 50,000 were outside the pocket but cut off from retreat routes. The encirclement was complete. What followed was slaughter on an industrial scale. The German breakout attempt on August 18th and 19th was desperate, chaotic, and partially successful despite catastrophic casualties. Units that still had leadership and cohesion formed Kampfgruppen battle groups combining remnants of multiple divisions into ad hoc formations. These groups attacked the Chambois corridor in human waves, trying to break through Polish and American positions before the pocket was completely sealed. Some attacks succeeded through sheer desperation. German soldiers charged Allied positions with whatever weapons they had, rifles, machine guns, even hand-to-hand combat when ammunition ran out. The fighting at Chambois was described by survivors as more brutal than anything experienced earlier in the war. There were no tactics, no manoeuvre, just direct assault against prepared positions by troops who knew they were fighting for survival. Between 20,000 and 40,000 Germans escaped through the Chambois gap before it was finally sealed on August 21st. But they escaped without heavy equipment, without organisation, as individuals or small groups, rather than military formations. They survived, but they ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The interior of the Falaise pocket became known simply as the Corridor of Death, and aerial photographs don't capture what soldiers on the ground experienced. The pocket was roughly 8 miles long and 3 miles wide by August 19th, 24 square miles, packed with the remnants of 20 German divisions. Allied artillery fired into the pocket continuously. Fighter bombers attacked anything that moved. The roads were clogged with destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, dead horses, and bodies. The smell was overwhelming, decomposing corpses, dead horses, burning vehicles, all in summer heat. German units attempting to organise retreats found roads impassable. Vehicles attempting to move were destroyed instantly by air attack. Soldiers attempting to walk were killed by artillery. The few Germans who escaped described the pocket as hell on earth, continuous bombardment, with no cover, no escape, no hope except to surrender or die. American and British soldiers who entered the pocket after German surrender were horrified by the scale of destruction. One American lieutenant wrote in his diary, "I have seen men die in combat, this wasn't combat. This was execution." General Dwight Eisenhower toured the Falaise pocket on August 21st with General Bradley and described it as scenes that could only be described by Dante. The Supreme Commander had seen combat photographs and casualty statistics throughout the war, but nothing prepared him for the physical reality of the Falaise battlefield. The main road from Falaise to Chambois, roughly 8 miles, was impassable except on foot because of destroyed vehicles. Every 50 feet there was a wrecked truck, tank, or artillery piece. Dead horses were everywhere. The German army still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport, and thousands of horses died in the pocket. Bodies were visible in fields, ditches, and vehicles. The destruction was so complete that engineers needed bulldozers to clear roads. Gray's registration units estimated 10,000 to 15,000 German dead in the pocket, but the real number was higher because many bodies were never found or identified. The Falaise pocket wasn't a battle in any conventional sense. It was the destruction of an army that had been trapped, bombarded, and systematically eliminated. The argument about whether the Falaise gap should have been closed faster would continue for decades after the war. American forces under Patton reached Argentan on August 13th and requested permission to continue north to Falaise, closing the gap from the south. Bradley denied permission, concerned about American and Canadian forces firing on each other in the confusion. The decision allowed Polish and Canadian forces to close the gap from the north instead. But it took them 8 additional days, August 13th to August 21st. During those 8 days, between 20,000 and 40,000 Germans escaped. Critics argued that if Bradley had allowed Patton to close the gap on August 13th, the encirclement would have been complete and the destruction total. Defenders argued that American forces were overextended, that closing from the north was sounder tactically, that the delay didn't matter because the Germans who escaped were broken formations without equipment. The debate is unresolvable. What's certain is that the Falaise encirclement destroyed German Army Group B as an effective fighting force, regardless of how many individuals escaped. The question of whether it could have been more complete is academic compared to the reality that it succeeded. The Polish 1st Armoured Division suffered 20% casualties, closing the Falaise Gap and holding it against German breakout attempts. The division lost 1,500 men killed and wounded in 4 days of combat at Chambois. The casualties were accepted because the Poles understood they were destroying the German forces that had occupied their homeland. When German units surrendered to Polish forces, there was no fraternization, no mutual respect between professional soldiers that sometimes characterized surrenders elsewhere. The Poles had witnessed their country's destruction, their families' deportation or death, 5 years of brutal occupation. The Falaise battle was personal for them in ways it wasn't for American or British troops. The division's performance was exceptional by any standard. They held their positions against repeated German attacks, closed the gap despite casualties, and prevented German escape. The price was substantial, but from the Polish perspective, entirely worth paying to help destroy German military power in France. By August 21st, the Falaise pocket was sealed and cleared. 50,000 Germans were captured, 10,000 to 15,000 were dead, 2,000 destroyed vehicles littered the battlefield, 1,000 artillery pieces were abandoned or destroyed. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army ceased to exist as organised formations. Army Group B was reduced from 20 divisions to scattered remnants totaling perhaps 20,000 combat-effective troops. The immediate military consequence was that German forces in France no longer had the strength to defend any position effectively. The path to Paris and the Seine was open. The long-term consequence was that Germany lost an entire field army that couldn't be replaced. These weren't conscripts or second-rate troops. These were experienced divisions that had fought since D-Day, veteran soldiers who knew their profession. They were irreplaceable. Their destruction at Falaise guaranteed that Germany couldn't defend France, and meant that the war's end was no longer a question of whether, but when. The Falaise encirclement was the decisive battle of the Normandy campaign, even more than D-Day or Operation Cobra. It destroyed German combat power in France permanently. The controversy about closing the gap faster overlooked the reality that what happened inside the pocket was more important than how many escaped. The Germans who escaped walked out without equipment, without organisation, without combat power. The divisions that escaped in name ceased to exist in reality. Paper formations with distinguished histories but no troops, no weapons, no transport. The German army would attempt to rebuild these divisions, but it would take months and drain resources from other theatres. The immediate impact was that German forces couldn't defend the Seine, couldn't defend Paris, couldn't establish any defensive line short of Germany itself. The strategic consequences were more important than the tactical debate about gap closure. Falaise destroyed German military power in France. Everything after was pursuit and exploitation. The Germans who escaped survived as individuals, but not as military formations. And in total war, surviving as individuals is strategically irrelevant if your military formations cease to exist. Falaise was slaughter, but it was strategically necessary slaughter that shortened the war by months. The moral cost was enormous. The military value was decisive. And the images of the corridor of death, the destroyed vehicles, the dead horses, the bodies in fields, became the defining images of German defeat in France. Sometimes victory is ugly. Falaise was proof. The first American troops entered Chartres on August 18th to crowds that hadn't eaten properly in 4 years and didn't care. They threw flowers at tanks, shared wine they'd hidden from Germans, kissed soldiers who didn't speak French and didn't need to. An old man wept while shaking hands with a 19-year-old private from Iowa who didn't understand why until someone explained that the man's son had died in 1940 resisting the German invasion. This scene repeated in dozens of towns across France in late August 1944. Liberation was joy and grief simultaneously. Joy for freedom regained after 4 years of occupation. Grief for what those 4 years had cost. The Americans rolling through France saw civilians cheering and didn't see the collaboration trials beginning in back rooms. The summary executions of accused collaborators, the women having their heads shaved for sleeping with German soldiers. Liberation was messy, complicated, and deeply human. It wasn't the clean victory that newsreels showed. It was the painful reality of communities processing betrayal, loss, and survival while celebrating freedom they'd thought might never come. Paris was liberated on August 25th by the French 2nd Armoured Division under General Philippe Leclerc, supported by American forces, and the symbolism mattered more than The tactics. Eisenhower could have bypassed Paris. The city wasn't strategically critical. Taking it would consume supplies needed for pursuit operations. But Paris was symbolically essential. France's capital had been under German occupation since June 1940. Its liberation would signal German defeat more powerfully than any battlefield victory. Leclerc's division entered Paris on August 24th against scattered German resistance. The German military commander, General Dietrich von Koltitz, surrendered on August 25th despite Hitler's explicit orders to destroy the city. Von Koltitz would later claim he refused to destroy Paris because he couldn't bring himself to annihilate such a beautiful city. More likely, he refused because destroying Paris would have marked him as a war criminal, and he knew Germany was losing. Regardless of motivation, Paris was liberated intact. 2 million people filled the streets. Charles de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées in triumph, and the world saw that German occupation of France was ending. The Norman countryside told a different story than the celebrations in Paris. American soldiers driving through Normandy in late August saw villages that were 90% destroyed. They saw fields cratered by artillery. They saw dead livestock rotting in summer heat. They saw French civilians returning to homes that no longer existed, standing amid rubble, trying to find something, anything, salvageable. The Norman campaign had been fought primarily in French territory, which meant French civilians paid a price for liberation that soldiers never fully appreciated. 20,000 French civilians were killed during the Normandy campaign, roughly 1/3 by Allied bombing, 1/3 by Allied artillery, 1/3 by German action or combat casualties. 586,000 French civilians were made homeless. 14 Norman cities were more than 50% destroyed. The liberation of France cost France as much as the German occupation in purely physical terms. Villages liberated in June remained destroyed in August because there were no resources to rebuild. Farms liberated from Germans couldn't be farmed because they were mined or crated. Liberation brought freedom, but not prosperity. It would take years to rebuild what months of combat destroyed. The collaboration trials began immediately after liberation in a process that was part justice, part revenge, and wholly chaotic. French resistance members identified suspected collaborators, people who'd worked with German authorities, police who'd arrested resistance members, businessmen who'd profited from German contracts, women who'd had relationships with German soldiers. Some accusations were accurate, some were false, motivated by personal grudges or jealousy. The trials were improvised. There was no functioning French legal system in August 1944 because the Vichy government had collapsed and the Free French government wasn't yet established. Resistance groups administered rough justice. Approximately 10,000 French citizens were executed in the immediate aftermath of liberation, many without trial. Thousands more were imprisoned. Women accused of horizontal collaboration relationships with Germans were publicly humiliated, their heads shaved, paraded through streets. Allied commanders were disturbed by the extrajudicial nature of French score settling, but didn't interfere because it was internal French matter. The liberation wasn't just freedom from German occupation. It was reckoning with 4 years of compromises, betrayals, and survival choices that French communities needed to process however they could. The logistics of liberating France created problems that would constrain operations for months. Every town liberated needed military government to restore order. Every bridge destroyed needed engineers to rebuild or bypass it. Every rail line cut needed repair before it could transport supplies. Every port captured needed clearing before it could receive ships. The Allied advance was moving faster than the infrastructure could be restored. By September 1st, Allied forces reached the Belgian border 300 miles from the Normandy beaches. Supply trucks were driving 600-mile round trips from Normandy beaches to frontline units. The Red Bull Express was operating at maximum capacity but couldn't deliver enough. Fuel shortages were worsening. Ammunition was rationed. The pursuit was outrunning its logistics, creating the paradox that operational success was creating strategic constraints. Liberation was happening faster than the liberated territory could be organised to support the armies doing the liberating. The entry into Belgium on September 2nd revealed the different character of liberation in different countries. Belgian civilians hadn't suffered 4 years of occupation and collaboration trials like France. Their liberation was simpler, more joyous, less complicated by internal divisions. American soldiers reported that Belgian welcomes were warmer than French because there was less baggage. The Belgians had resisted, survived, and was simply grateful for liberation without the complex emotions that characterized French communities. The difference illustrated that occupation and liberation weren't uniform experiences. Each country, each region, each town had its own story of survival and collaboration. Liberation meant different things depending on what occupation had cost. For some French towns, liberation meant freedom and joy. For others, it meant freedom and bitter reckoning with choices made during occupation. There was no single liberation experience. There were thousands of individual stories of communities trying to process 4 years of war in the chaos of military operations still ongoing. Cherbourg remained demolished 4 months after capture, a symbol of the limits of liberation. American forces had captured the port on June 26, expecting it to be operational by August. By September, it still wasn't functional. German demolitions had been so thorough that clearing the harbour required specialised equipment, technical expertise, and time that operations couldn't spare. Engineers worked continuously, but progress was measured in weeks. The first ships entered Cherbourg harbour on September 16th, 82 days after the city's capture. Even then, capacity was limited. The port that was supposed to solve Allied logistics problems became operational only after the campaign had moved 300 miles beyond it. The irony was, painful American soldiers died capturing Cherbourg to solve supply problems. But the supply problems continued for months after capture because the port couldn't be made functional quickly. Liberation didn't automatically create usable infrastructure. It just ended German control over unusable infrastructure that would require months of engineering work to restore. The human cost of liberating Normandy became clear in September when casualty statistics were compiled. American forces suffered 209,000 casualties in the Normandy campaign, 29,000 killed, 106,000 wounded, 20,000 missing. British and Canadian forces suffered 74,000 casualties, 16,000 killed, 58,000 wounded. German casualties approached 400,000, 200,000 killed or wounded, 200,000 captured. French civilian casualties were 20,000 killed, estimated 50,000 wounded or injured. The mathematics of liberation were brutal. Nearly 700,000 people became casualties to liberate a region of France 300 miles across. The cost per mile of advance was unsustainable for long campaigns. The cost per day was consuming armies faster than replacements could rebuild to them. Liberation of France succeeded because Germany couldn't match Allied resources, but the resource cost even for the victor was staggering. Total war is won by the side that can sustain casualties longer, not by the side that avoids casualties. The Normandy campaign proved it at a human cost that's difficult to comprehend even 80 years later. By September 1st, 1944, the Normandy campaign was over and the pursuit into Germany was beginning. France was liberated except for ports and pockets of German resistance that would be cleaned up over following weeks. Allied forces were advancing on a broad front toward Germany. The liberation had succeeded beyond even optimistic predictions. France was freed in 3 months compared to 4 years of stalemate in World War I. But the physical and human cost of liberation left scars that would take generations to heal. Norman towns rebuilt slowly over decades. French communities processed collaboration and resistance through trials that continued into the 1950s. Veterans processed combat trauma in the decades after, many never fully recovering from what they'd experienced. The liberation was complete in military terms by September 1st. In human terms, the cost of liberation continued being paid for the rest of the 20th century. Freedom isn't free. The cliché is true, but inadequate to describe what liberation cost the people who lived through it. The celebrations in August 1944 were real. So was the suffering that preceded them and the difficult rebuilding that followed. Liberation was the beginning of recovery, not its completion. And recovery from total war takes longer than fighting the war itself. The chief statistician at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force sat at his desk in September 1944 with casualty reports that told the story of the Normandy campaign in numbers that didn't capture the human reality. American casualties, 29,000 dead. British and Canadian casualties, 16,000 dead. German casualties, 200,000 killed or captured. French civilian casualties, 20,000 dead. The numbers were precise and meaningless simultaneously. They quantified loss without explaining what was lost. They measured cost without capturing what was purchased. The statistician's job was to compile the numbers for the historical record, knowing that future historians would argue about whether the cost was justified. His answer, which he never wrote in official reports, was that mathematics couldn't answer moral questions. 45,000 Allied soldiers died liberating Normandy. 200,000 Germans died defending it. 20,000 French civilians died during the liberation. Was it worth it? The question assumed there were alternatives that cost less. There weren't. This was total war between industrial nations. The cost was catastrophic because the stakes were civilization. The numbers in the casualty reports represented individual tragedies, parents who lost sons, wives who lost husbands, children who grew up without fathers. But they also represented strategic victory that prevented Soviet domination of Western Europe and shortened the war by an estimated year. Both things were true. The cost was unbearable. The alternative was worse. The strategic assessment, written in September 1944 by Allied intelligence, concluded that the Normandy campaign succeeded 11 months ahead of World War I's timeline for liberating equivalent French territory. In World War I, Allied forces required 4 years to push Germany out of France. In World War II, it took 3 months from D-Day to liberation of Paris. The difference was operational doctrine. World War II emphasized breakthrough and exploitation rather than attrition. The cost per mile was horrific, but the campaign was 3 months rather than 4 years. The strategic victory was purchased with tactical casualties, but avoided strategic slaughter. The analysis noted that without the successful invasion, Stalin's Red Army would have been the sole liberator of Western Europe. Soviet forces were advancing toward Poland by September 1944. If there had been no Western Front, Soviet forces would have reached France eventually. The political consequences would have been catastrophic. France, Belgium, Netherlands, all would have been in the Soviet sphere of influence. The Normandy invasion wasn't just military operation. It was political necessity that determined Europe's post-war structure. The cost must be measured against what failure would have meant: Soviet control of Western Europe and continued German control of France. From that perspective, the casualties were terrible but necessary. The veterans began processing their experiences in ways that wouldn't become public for decades. In September 1944, they were still fighting, still advancing toward Germany, still losing friends to combat. There was no time for reflection, no opportunity to process trauma. The processing would come later for some, in the 1960s and 70s, when the war became historical enough to discuss. For others, never. Many World War II veterans never discussed their combat experiences with families or friends. The reasons varied. Some couldn't find words for what they'd experienced. Some didn't want to burden others. Some tried to forget. The veteran who landed on Omaha Beach and watched his friends die in the surf didn't tell that story at dinner parties. The veteran who fought house to house in Saint-Lô didn't describe killing German soldiers at close range. The veteran who survived the Bocage fighting didn't explain hedgerow warfare to people who'd never left America. Combat trauma was personal, incommunicable, and carried silently by hundreds of thousands of men who returned home and tried to rebuild normal lives. The psychological casualties of Normandy weren't counted in official statistics, but were as real as physical wounds. The June 6, 1984 40th anniversary ceremony at Pointe du Hoc became the moment when Normandy veterans publicly processed what they'd done. President Ronald Reagan spoke to assembled veterans, many in their 60s, and described them as the boys of Pointe du Hoc, who'd climbed cliffs under fire to disable German guns. The veterans wept publicly, many for the first time since the war. The ceremony acknowledged their sacrifice in ways that post-war America hadn't. The immediate post-war period treated veterans as heroes but didn't ask about trauma. The 1980s began treating veterans as survivors, with stories worth hearing. The Pointe du Hoc ceremony was cathartic for many veterans who'd carried their experiences silently for 40 years. They were finally able to discuss what they'd done, what they'd lost, and what it cost them personally. The ceremony didn't resolve trauma. Combat trauma doesn't resolve, but it validated the experience and acknowledged the sacrifice in public ways that mattered to men who'd fought in private hell. The 40th anniversary began the process of transforming Normandy veterans from silent survivors into honoured witnesses to history. The German veterans' perspective on Normandy remained largely unheard until decades after the war, when historians began interviewing survivors. German soldiers who defended Normandy described a different battle than American narratives portrayed. They described fighting against overwhelming material superiority, knowing they would lose but fighting anyway because retreat meant execution by SS enforcers or military police. They described the terror of Allied air supremacy, the constant bombing, the inability to move during daylight, the knowledge that every position would eventually be destroyed. They described the Falaise Pocket as the worst experience of the war, worse than the Eastern Front for those who'd fought there. German veterans didn't claim moral equivalence. They knew their country had started the war and committed atrocities. But they did claim recognition as soldiers who'd fought professionally under impossible conditions. The admission that German defenders fought well doesn't glorify Nazism. It acknowledges military reality. The Allies won Normandy through material superiority and operational skill, but they didn't win because German defenders were cowards or incompetents. They won against professional soldiers who were overmatched but dangerous to the end. The Normandy American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, overlooking Omaha Beach, holds 9,387 graves, a fraction of American casualties from the campaign. Most American dead were returned to the United States for burial per family requests. The cemetery represents approximately 1/3 of Americans who died in the Normandy campaign. Walking through it creates visceral impact that statistics cannot. Row after row of white crosses and stars of David. Identical headstones marking individual tragedies. Many graves marked, "Here rests in honoured glory." A comrade in arms, known but to God, unidentified remains. The cemetery is beautiful and terrible simultaneously. It honours sacrifice while acknowledging cost. Visitors walk through and process that each headstone represents a person who had a life, family, future, and lost everything in France. The cemetery doesn't answer whether the sacrifice was worth it. It simply acknowledges that it happened and must be remembered. The 9,000 graves visible are a reminder of 29,000 American dead and 29,000 individual stories that ended in France. The strategic outcome of the Normandy campaign was preventing Soviet domination of Western Europe, which is abstract until considering the alternative. If the Western Allies hadn't invaded France in June 1944, Soviet forces would have continued advancing westward after defeating Germany in the east. Stalin's armies were already in Poland by autumn 1944. They would reach Berlin by April 1945. Without Western Allied presence in France, Soviet forces would have been sole liberators of Germany and could have occupied France, Belgium, Netherlands, possibly even Italy. The Iron Curtain that descended across Eastern Europe would have been farther west, potentially at the Rhine or even the Atlantic. Western European democracy survived because American, British, and Canadian forces landed in Normandy and liberated France before Soviet forces could. This wasn't speculation. Stalin made clear at Tehran and Yalta conferences that he expected Soviet sphere of influence to include territory his armies liberated. The Normandy invasion was a military operation with profound political consequences that shaped the post-war world for 70 years. The cost in lives was terrible. The alternative would have been catastrophic for Western civilization. The debate about whether the campaign could have been conducted differently with fewer casualties continued through the rest of the 20th century. Could the bocage fighting have been avoided through better intelligence about Norman terrain? Probably not. The hedgerows were visible on maps, but their tactical impact was unpredictable. Could Operation Cobra have succeeded without carpet bombing and friendly casualties? Possibly German defences were crumbling anyway. Could the Falaise Gap have been closed faster, trapping more Germans? Maybe, but those who escaped were broken formations without equipment. Each debate assumes alternative decisions would have produced better outcomes at lower cost. The reality is that amphibious invasion of occupied France against professional German military was inherently costly, regardless of decisions made. The Allies made mistakes, intelligence failures, friendly fire, logistics problems, tactical errors. But the campaign succeeded in 3 months at cost lower than World War I's comparable operations. The criticism assumes perfection was possible. It wasn't. War is chaos managed imperfectly by imperfect people, making decisions with incomplete information under lethal pressure. The Normandy campaign was successful despite mistakes, not because there weren't mistakes. The long-term impact of Normandy on military doctrine was profound and lasting. The campaign demonstrated that amphibious assault against prepared defences could succeed with overwhelming firepower, air supremacy, and willingness to accept catastrophic casualties during initial phases. It demonstrated that breakthrough required concentration of force in time and space. Operation Cobra worked because resources were massed for single operation rather than distributed across entire front. It demonstrated that mobile warfare required logistics infrastructure that could sustain rapid advance. Third Army's breakout succeeded until logistics couldn't keep pace. It demonstrated that air supremacy was decisive in modern warfare. German counterattacks failed primarily because aircraft destroyed them during approach marches. Every subsequent amphibious operation in military history, Incheon, Falklands, Desert Storm, applied lessons from Normandy. The campaign became the model for joint operations combining land, sea, and air forces. The doctrine cost 156,000 casualties to develop. But it worked, and it shaped military operations for the remainder of the 20th century. The moral question of whether the cost was worth it cannot be answered by historians or strategists. It can only be answered by individuals processing their own values and priorities. Was it worth 29,000 American lives to liberate France? Was it worth 16,000 British and Canadian lives to prevent Soviet domination of Western Europe? Was it worth 20,000 French civilian lives to be liberated? The answers depend on what you value: individual lives, national freedom, political systems, civilizational survival. There is no objective answer. There's only the historical reality that those costs were paid and those outcomes were achieved. The men who died on Omaha Beach didn't die to prevent Soviet expansion. They died because they stepped off landing craft into machine gun fire and couldn't reach cover. The strategic outcomes were byproducts of millions of individual tactical actions, most of which were survival-focused rather than strategically motivated. But the aggregate result of those individual actions was liberation of France and prevention of Soviet control of Western Europe. The cost and the outcome are both real. They exist in history as facts that cannot be changed and must be evaluated by each generation based on that generation's values. The final assessment must acknowledge that the Normandy campaign was simultaneously triumph and tragedy. It was military triumph, successful invasion against prepared defences, operational victory over professional German military, strategic success in preventing Soviet domination of Western Europe. It was human tragedy, 125,000 Allied casualties, 400,000 German casualties, 20,000 French civilian deaths, destruction of Norman countryside and cities, trauma carried by survivors for the remainder of their lives. Both assessments are true. The campaign succeeded in its strategic objectives while costing catastrophic human price. The soldiers who fought it were heroes who accomplished something extraordinarily difficult. They were also victims of war's brutality who suffered losses that can't be quantified in casualty statistics. The civilians who endured it were liberated from Nazi occupation while losing their homes and loved ones. All of these contradictions are true simultaneously. The Normandy campaign can't be reduced to simple narrative of good versus evil, though the cause was just. It can't be simplified to statistics, though the numbers are staggering. It can only be understood as complex historical event where necessary military action produced strategic victory at terrible human cost. The victory was real, the cost was real, and 80 years later, both must be remembered because forgetting either would dishonor the people who lived through it. The price of liberty was paid in Normandy in summer 1944. The invoice showed 125,000 Allied casualties for freedom of Western Europe. History records that the price was paid in full. Whether it should have been asked is question each generation must answer for itself.